Night without a moon, wind out of the northwest, smoke first. Thick, wrong. It rolled under the bedroom door like it had somewhere urgent to be. Then the roar, wood splitting. Horses screaming inside a wall of orange flame. Two figures burst from the house, barefoot across the dark yard. The barn was already a furnace. Flames climbing the near side, eating into the roof. Inside, pure panic. A lead rope, a low wordless hum cutting through the choking smoke. The animal that used to kill men pressed its warm nose into a hand that refused to let go. A support beam cracked like a gunshot. They dragged the last horses into the cold night air, half-blind, lungs burning. In the dirt outside, blood ran down an arm. Higher up, near the elbow, an older scar-thin, pale, nothing to do with tonight's fire. Something ended in the ash. Something else had only just begun. Ironwood Hollow, 1888. Before the dust, before the fiddle music and the good boots and the whole town, pretending it wasn't cruel one day a year, there was a kitchen. Small, hot from the stove even at dawn. Beatrice Prescott stood at the counter kneading bread. Nobody would thank her for, while upstairs her sisters fought over a curling iron like it was the last one on earth, which, in that house, it might as well have been. Bea, the blue ribbon. Have you seen it? Ruth's voice thin and demanding through the floorboards. Bea didn't answer. She'd learned a long time ago that answering just meant more questions. Her father came down first, vest buttoned, boots already shined, because a man planning to stand on a platform and be admired started admiring himself before anybody else got the chance. He looked at her the way he always looked at her, quick, sliding, like his eyes had somewhere better to be and her face wasn't worth the detour. "You're not wearing that to the square," he said. "Not a question. I wasn't planning to stand up front, Pa." "Good." He poured his own coffee, didn't offer to pour hers. "Wouldn't want you blocking the view. It shouldn't have landed anywhere." She'd built calluses for exactly this kind of thing, years of them, thick enough that most words just slid off now the way water slides off a well-oiled saddle, except some mornings the calluses wore thin. This was one of those mornings. Because it was Bride Fair Day, and Bride Fair Day had a way of finding every soft, unprotected place a person had left and pressing down on it once hard, just to make sure it still hurt. It still hurt. Louisa came down next in the rose-colored dress, and the whole kitchen seemed to brighten all around her the way a room brightens when somebody opens the curtains. Elias's face did something Bea hadn't seen it do for her, ever. Not once, not in 20 years. "There she is," he said, warm as she'd never once heard him sound. "There's my girl." Bea kept kneading the bread, didn't look up, because if she looked up, something in her face might show, and showing things had never once gone well for her in this house. "You'll do us proud today," Elias told Louisa and Ruth, and almost as an afterthought, already halfway out the door, the both of you. The both of you. Two names folded into two daughters, a third one left standing at the counter with flour on her hands and no ribbon in her hair, and nobody in that kitchen so much as glanced her way to notice. The arithmetic didn't add up. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself that so often it had started to sound almost true. If she said it fast enough, if she didn't leave herself too much silence afterward to hear how it actually sounded. By the time she'd finished the bread and cleaned the flour from under her nails and walked the 2 miles into town because nobody had thought to save her a seat in the wagon, the square was already full. Dust first. Always dust first. It rolled off the wagons and settled on the church and the mercantile awning and the good black boots of men who'd polished them the night before for exactly this. One day a year. Bride Fair Day. The only day the town dressed itself up like it mattered. Sheriff Elias Prescott stood on the platform like he owned the sky above it, chest out, thumbs hooked in his vest. A man built for standing on things and looking down at people. Behind him, his daughters. Louisa first, because Louisa was always first. Rose-colored dress, dark curls that caught the light like they'd been paid to. Men stopped talking when she smiled. Some of them stopped breathing. Ruth beside her. Blue silk. Pretty enough that nobody remembered her 5 minutes later. And then the space where a third daughter should have stood. Beatrice Prescott wasn't on the platform. She was behind it, half hidden by a support beam that wasn't nearly wide enough to hide her. Not really, because there was a lot of her to hide. 6 feet and 2 inches of her. Shoulders like a man who split his own wood, which she did every single week, because nobody else in that house would touch an axe if she was standing nearby to do it for them. Crowd didn't look at her. The crowd had learned not to, which was its own kind of cruelty, the looking away kind, worse than the staring some days. Fairest girls in 3 counties, a woman near the front whispered, and her friend agreed, and neither of them meant all 3 of the sheriff's daughters. They meant 2. Everybody in Ironwood Hollow had gotten very good at meaning 2 when they said 3. Bea heard it. Of course she heard it. She'd heard some version of that sentence every bride fair since she was 14 years old and had stopped being a tall girl and started being a problem. She didn't flinch. She'd trained herself out of flinching a long time ago. Instead, she watched the men line up at the base of the platform, each one presenting himself like a prize bull. Cattle, mostly, and land, and one man who owned half the freight line to Cheyenne and said so twice in one sentence. Her father ate it up, nodded along, let his gaze slide over each of them like he was pricing hogs, until the crowd went quiet. In that particular way crowds go quiet, not silence. The silence right before somebody gets laughed at. A stranger had stepped forward, tall, not showy tall like a man who knew it, just tall the way a fence post is tall, built for use and nothing else, sun-browned. A short beard he'd trimmed himself badly, with a blade that had seen better decades. His boots wore 3 counties of trail dust, and his coat had a tear at the shoulder that somebody had stitched with the wrong color thread. Bea watched him from behind the beam and thought, without meaning to, that he looked like a man who'd walked a long way to get somewhere and was sure yet if it was the right place. "And who might you be, stranger?" Her father's voice. Amused, the way a cat is amused by something that still has legs. "Name's Jonas Hartwell." He didn't look away. That was the first thing. Men usually looked away from Beatrice Prescott inside of 5 seconds. This one didn't. "I've got land 20 miles north. Small, but it's mine free and clear. By the fair's own rule, any man who can provide has the right to ask." Somebody near the back laughed first. Then it spread, the way laughter does when it's cruel and looking for company. "Land," a voice called out. "Probably a lean-to and a one-legged mule." More laughing. Jonas's jaw went tight. Bea saw it tighten from 30 feet away, saw the exact muscle jump under the beard, and something in her chest did a small, unhelpful thing. Recognition, maybe. She knew what it looked like from the inside. Holding your face still while a crowd took its turns with you. "I've got skill, too," Jonas said, over the laughter. "Not louder than it. Just steadier. I can break horses, work cattle, build what needs building." Her father's grin widened into something that made Bea's stomach drop before he'd even said the words. She'd seen that grin before. It meant a trap was already built and the only thing left was watching some fool walk into it. "Skill, you say?" "Yes, sir, then prove it," and there it was. "I've got a stallion," Elias said Fuitz, turning it into a performance now, playing the crowd like a fiddle he'd owned for years. Black as midnight, meaner than the devil on a Sunday. 3 trainers tried him. 2 got trampled for their trouble. 1 rode off in the dark and never came back for his wages. The crowd leaned in. Bea felt her own body lean without permission, some old instinct that hadn't gotten the message that this story always ended the same way. "You tamed that horse, Cowboy," her father said, "and I'll give you my daughter." He gestured toward the platform, toward Louisa. Of course toward Louisa, because Louisa was the only daughter that gesture had ever meant. Bea watched the stranger's eyes go to her sister, watched them do the thing every man's eyes did to Louisa, that soft, helpless widening, like a door swinging open in a house he hadn't meant to walk into. She'd seen that look 1,000 times. It never got easier to watch land somewhere else. "I accept," Jonas said. Her father's smirk turned into something with teeth in it. 3 months. "Come fall, we'll see if you're still walking, Mr. Hartwell." The crowd roared. Somebody started taking bets on how many days he'd last. Somebody else offered odds against the horse ever being ridden at all. Near the back, beneath the shade of the mercantile awning, a man in a fine gray coat watched the whole spectacle without joining the laughter. Silas Danvers didn't need to laugh. He'd learned a long time ago that a man who stayed quiet while everyone else made noise was a man people remembered, and being remembered, in his experience, was worth more than being liked. He watched Beatrice Prescott soak up the crowd's approval like a plant starved for rain. Watched the stranger, Hartwell, walk off toward his horse with his jaw set and his pride bruised and no earthly idea what he'd just agreed to. Danvers smiled, small and private, the kind of smile that never made it as far as a stranger noticing it, because he knew that stallion, knew exactly how it had gotten its temper, and exactly how unlikely it was that some drifter with a torn coat was going to undo 4 years of careful, deliberate ruin in 3 short months. Which suited him fine either way. If the cowboy failed, well, that was one less complication in a town where he already had plans laid for the Prescott family, plans that didn't much involve a penniless outsider mucking things up. And if, by some strange miracle, the man succeeded, Danvers's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes went colder, more considering. Well, there were other ways to make sure a wager's outcome didn't inconvenience him. There always were, but for a man with his particular resources. He turned and walked back toward his carriage without waiting to see the rest of the fair play out. He had a note to collect from Beatrice Prescott after all, and men who owed him money had a way of becoming very agreeable about whatever else he decided he wanted from them. Bea slipped away from the beam before anyone could look at the space where she'd been standing and wonder why. She had feed to put out. She had a horse to check on. She had, unlike everyone laughing in that square, actual work waiting for her, and work had always been kinder to her than people. 2 days later, the Prescott Ranch sprawled out past the edge of town, White House and good fences, and a barn that had been painted more recently than most churches. Behind the barn, set apart, reinforced with timber twice as thick as anywhere else on the property, sat a separate corral. Jonas heard it before he saw it. Hooves like thunder that had learned to hate something specific, a crack of splitting wood, a scream that was too close to human for comfort, the kind of sound that made a man's hand go instinctively toward a gun he wasn't wearing. He came around the corner of the barn and stopped. The horse was enormous, black from nose to tail, no white anywhere, like something poured rather than born. It reared against the fence and slammed both front hooves down so hard the ground shook under Jonas's boots. Its eyes rolled white at the edges, fury mostly. But underneath the fury, something else, something Jonas recognized because he'd worn it himself once, a long time ago, in a different kind of corral. Fear dressed up as violence, because violence was easier to survive with. "You the fool taking pasbet?" He turned. A woman stood a few feet off, a feed bucket balanced against one hip like it weighed nothing, which for her it probably didn't. 20 years old, maybe. Round, sun-browned face. Shoulder-length hair the color of wet sand, tied back with a strip of rawhide because ribbons had clearly never made it out this far. And tall. Taller than Jonas by an inch, maybe two. With shoulders built for lifting things men usually needed 2 hands and a friend to lift. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't afraid either, which struck him as strange, standing 40 feet from a horse that had just tried to put a hoof through a fence rail. "I'm Jonas Hartwell. I know who you are, flat. Not unkind. Just flat. The way a woman talks when she's had a lifetime of practice keeping her voice from giving anything away. Whole town's talking about the idiot who took Pa's bet." She walked past him, straight toward the corral. The stallion charged the fence at her approach, snorting, kicking, and Jonas's whole body flinched forward to grab her arm, to pull her back. Some instinct from 10 years of watching men die from smaller mistakes than standing too close to an animal like that. She didn't flinch. She set the bucket just outside the rail and stepped back exactly 2 paces. Not 4, not 6. Two like she'd measured it 100 times before and knew precisely how much room the horse needed and precisely how much she could afford to give. "Don't stand so close," she said without turning around. "He hates sudden movement. You're not afraid of him. He's just scared." She watched the horse circle, nostrils flaring, slowly closing the distance to the bucket like it might be a trick. Scared things lash out. Don't mean they're mean. Means somebody made them that way. "You feed him every day?" "Pa doesn't trust the hands near him anymore. Not since he put one through the fence." A pause. "So it's me." "And you're not afraid," he said again, because he needed to hear the answer twice, apparently, to believe it. And she glanced at him then, just for a second. Something moved behind her eyes, quick as a fish underwater, gone before he could name it. Pity, maybe, or something closer to recognition. "You're the sheriff's daughter," Jonas said, realizing it slow, the way a man realizes he's been standing in the rain for 10 minutes. She nodded once. "Beatrice Prescott, Bea." He looked at her properly then, not the way the crowd had looked past her at the fair, sliding their eyes off her like she was a fence post nobody needed to remark on. Really looked. No silk, no curled hair. A plain cotton dress gone soft and pale from 100 washings. Sleeves rolled to the elbow for the morning's work. Dust ground into the hem, and a fresh bruise yellowing on her lower forearm. Near the wrist, from hauling feed sacks that were never meant for one pair of hands to carry alone. "Why are you out here?" he asked. "Shouldn't you be inside? With your sisters?" Something in her face closed, quick and total, like a door slamming somewhere down a long hallway. "My sisters don't work." She picked the empty bucket back up. "I do." She started walking toward the house. "Wait," Jonas took a step after her. "You know this horse. I need your help." Didn't turn around. "You made the bet, Cowboy." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Not me." And then she was gone, around the corner of the barn, and Jonas stood alone in front of a horse that hated him already for reasons that had nothing to do with him at all. 3 months, he thought. Suddenly it felt like a very short word for a very long stretch of time. Louise's face floated up in his mind, unbidden, rose-colored, and perfect. He held onto it the way a drowning man holds onto driftwood. Not because it was solid, because it was something. He had no choice, he told himself. He had to try. The first week broke him in pieces he didn't know he had. He couldn't get within 10 feet of the stallion without it charging the rail, teeth bared, ears flat back against its skull like a warning flag nobody could misread. Twice it nearly came through the fence entirely. Once a beam splintered clean through, and Jonas spent an hour replacing it with his ribs still singing from where he'd been thrown against the post-it, trying to get out of the way in time. His hands split open from the rope. He wrapped them in strips and tore afford his own shirt because he didn't afford new budgets and definitely couldn't afford to look weak in front of a town that was already taking bets against him. One of the ranch hands, a thick-necked man named Dutch who'd been with the Prescotts 11 years, leaned on the fence one morning and watched Jonas get thrown clean off his for the third time before breakfast. "You know he's killed a man's confidence before," Dutch said. "Not unkind. Just tired, the way men get tired of watching something they already know the ending to. Won't kill you outright. Just wish you down till you quit like the others." "I'm not quitting." "They all say that. Right up until they do." Jonas spat dirt out of his mouth and got back to his feet slow, because his ribs had opinions about moving fast that morning. Not much of an encouragement, Dutch. Wasn't meant to be one, because that was the thing nobody warned you about, taking on a bet like this. It wasn't the horse that broke a man first. It was the waiting. The mornings that all looked the same. The dirt that tasted the same every single time he hit it. Gritty and metallic with a little of his own blood mixed in. Until one morning he didn't get up right away. Just lay there a minute, staring at the sky, doing the arithmetic on how many mornings he had left before fall, and how many of them he could survive being thrown like this. "You planning on getting up?" Bea's voice, from somewhere above him. "Or is the ground just more comfortable than I figured?" He turned his head. She was standing at the rail with her arms crossed, not laughing, exactly, but close enough to it that he felt his pride flinch a little. "Resting my eyes. Your eyes are open. Then you're bleeding." "I noticed." "From your ear." "I noticed that too." She almost smiled. He caught the almost, filed it away someplace private, the way a man collects small good things during a stretch of mostly bad ones. "Get up, Mr. Hartwell." She held out a hand which surprised him more than the fall had. "Standing's better than lying there, feeling sorry for yourself." He took it. Her grip was strong enough to haul him up without strain, and for a second, just a second, neither of them let go quite as fast as the moment required. Except every morning, without fail, before the sun had cleared the ridgeline, Bea was already there. She never said much. Fed the horse, checked the trough. Left again, quiet as she'd come, like a woman who'd learned a long time ago that taking up less space with your words meant less chance of somebody using them against you later. But Jonas started noticing things, because that's what a man does when he's failing at something. He starts watching the one person who isn't failing. She hummed while she worked. Low, almost nothing, barely a tune at all, more like the memory of one. And the horse, this horse that had put grown men through fence rails, went still when she hummed. Not calm exactly, something short of calm, but still. One morning, after another failed rope attempt, left sitting in the dirt with blood running down one knuckle and pride running out of him like water from a cracked jug, Bea walked over, set a canteen down beside him without a word. "You're doing it wrong," she said. He looked up, wiped his hand on his trouser leg, which did nothing but smear the blood around. "Then tell me how to do it right." She glanced toward the house, a long look, like she was checking whether anyone was watching her do this particular kindness. Nobody was. She crouched down anyway, careful, like the habit of checking had worn a groove in her that wouldn't smooth out even when it wasn't needed. "He's not mean," she said. "He's hurt." "Hurt how? Look at his left side. See that line?" Jonas squinted through the dust. A long scar ran along the horse's ribs, raised and pale against the black coat. Too straight to be an accident, too regular to be anything but deliberate. His stomach turned over slow, like a wagon wheel finding a rut. Somebody whipped him, over and over. Her voice went flat again. That particular flatness, he was starting to understand, wasn't emptiness at all. It was a lid on something. That's why he hates rope. That's why he kicks when you come at him from the left. You keep coming at him from the left. "Mr. Hartwell, your father did that to him?" "No." She stood, brushed dust off her skirt in one hard motion. "The man he bought him from. Pa didn't care how the horse got broken down. He just wanted something that looked mean enough to brag about at the fair." Jonas's chest tightened around something he didn't have a name for yet. Who was the man? Bea's eyes flicked to him. Just for a heartbeat. And something passed behind them, a name she wasn't saying, a door she wasn't opening, not yet. Not to a stranger who'd been on the property 4 days. "Doesn't matter," she said, too quick, too smooth. The way a person answers when the truth is exactly the opposite of "doesn't matter." If you want to tame him, you have to earn his trust, not break him. "How do I do that?" She looked at him for a long moment, long enough that he felt it, actually felt the weight of being looked at by someone who wasn't looking past him. "Start," she said, "by not treating him like a beast, Then she picked up her bucket and walked away, and Jonas sat there in the dirt, turning her words over like a stone he couldn't quite skip right. He changed everything after that. Stopped roping, stopped cornering, started just sitting outside the rail, quiet, hour after hour, until his legs went numb and the sun moved across the whole sky, and the horse forgot to hate him quite so specifically. At first, the stallion ignored him entirely, which felt like progress because it was better than being charged. Then it paced, snorted, kicked the fence a few times, half-hearted, more habit than threat. Then slowly, so slowly, Jonas almost missed the exact moment it happened, it began to settle. Bea came by most evenings after her chores were done, when the light went long and gold and the whole ranch seemed to exhale. She taught him things nobody else in the county seemed to know. He likes oats better than hay, but only at dusk. Feed him oats at noon, he won't touch them. Noted, he calms down if you hum, not sing. Sing got words in it, and words make him nervous. Why would words make a horse nervous? She didn't answer that one. Just looked at the horse instead of him, and Jonas understood, without being told, that this was a door he wasn't getting through today either. Never come at him from the left, she said instead. You said that already. I'm saying it again because you keep forgetting. I don't keep forgetting. You forgot yesterday. He near took your ear off. That was a strategic retreat. The corner of her mouth did something. Not a smile, not quite, but close enough that Jonas felt an unreasonable little jolt of pride, like he'd won something worth winning. It happened on a Tuesday. He'd remember that detail forever afterward, oddly. The particular unremarkable Tuesdayness of it, gray sky, no wind, nothing about the morning that should have made it different from 30 other mornings just like it. Jonas was sitting on an overturned bucket 6 feet from the rail, humming the low, wordless tune Bea had taught him, not really expecting anything, mostly just doing it because doing it had become habit now, comfortable as breathing. The horse stopped pacing, just stopped, stood there in the middle of the corral with its ears swiveled forward, not back, forward, and Jonas held very still because 6 months of scouting had taught him that the moments that mattered most were usually the ones where moving at all could ruin everything. Shadow took a step toward him. Jonas's heart slammed once hard against his ribs. He kept humming, kept his hands loose and open on his knees, the way Bea had shown him, palms up, nothing to hide and nothing to grab with. Another step. The horse's head was lowered now, not in submission exactly, more in the particular relaxed carriage of an animal that had decided, for reasons of its own, that Jonas would never fully understand, that this moment was safe, 3 feet away. Jonas could feel the warmth coming off the horse's body, could see the old scar along its ribs rising and falling with each slow breath, could see, up close now, the particular dark liquid intelligence in its eye that had nothing at all to do with meanness and everything to do with a creature that had simply, finally, run out of reasons to be afraid. The stallion lowered its head the last few inches and pressed its nose, warm and impossibly gentle, against the back of Jonas's outstretched hand. Jonas didn't move, didn't breathe hardly, for one long suspended second that felt like it belonged to some larger version of time than the ordinary Tuesday kind. Well, he said finally, voice cracked and low. Hello to you too. He heard the gate latch behind him and didn't dare turn, not yet. Not while the horse was still standing there with its nose against his hand like something fragile that might shatter if he moved too fast. Bea had come around the barn corner with a feed bucket and stopped dead in the yard, and when Jonas finally did look back at her, slow, careful, he saw her hand had gone to her mouth, and her eyes were bright in a way he hadn't seen them before, bright and wet and entirely undefended. He touched you, she said, barely a whisper. He touched me, Jonas. His name, not Mr. Hartwell, not for the first time exactly, but the first time it had come out of her like that, unguarded, like a door swinging open before she'd remembered to check who was on the other side of it. Do you have any idea what that means? Tell me. It means he trusts you. She set the bucket down, slow, like her hands weren't entirely steady. Took me 2 years to get that. 2 years, and you did it in 9 weeks. I had a good teacher. The horse lifted its head at last, stepped back a pace, content now, unbothered, cropping at a tuft of grass near the rail, like the last 3 months of screaming and kicking had happened to some entirely different animal. Bea wiped at her eyes, quick and embarrassed, like she hadn't meant to let that much show. Don't get used to gentle, she said, but her voice had gone soft around the edges in a way that undercut the warning entirely. He can still turn on you. Trust isn't the same as tame. No, Jonas agreed, watching her rather than the horse now. I don't suppose it is. By the second week of this new approach, the stallion let him stand 15 feet away without so much as pinning its ears. By the third, 10 feet. Jonas's heart pounded every single time like it was the first time, but he'd learned to keep his breathing slow, his shoulders loose, the way Bea did it, the way she'd apparently been doing it her whole life without anyone ever once telling her she was good at it. "You're learning," she said one evening, arms crossed over the top rail, watching him stand 7 careful feet from a horse that used to try and kill men for sport. "Only because you're teaching me." She looked away fast, but not fast enough. He caught the color rising up her neck before she turned her face toward the sunset, like it had suddenly become very interesting. Neither of them said anything else for a while. The horse shifted its weight, blew out a long breath through its nose, and for the first time since Jonas had arrived, the whole corral felt almost peaceful. By the end of the 2nd month, they'd settled into a rhythm neither one of them had planned. She'd finish her work in the house cooking for a family that never once thanked her for it, scrubbing floors nobody else in the household had touched with their own hands in years, and then she'd slip out to the stables while the light was still holding. He'd already be there, working the horse or mending tack or just sitting with his back against the rail thinking too hard about things he didn't want to think about. And they'd talk, not about nothing. Bea didn't do small talk, he'd learned that fast. She talked like every word cost her something, and she wasn't in the habit of spending carelessly. Not every evening was easy, though. Some evenings the world came looking for Bea even out here, past the barn, where she'd thought she was safe from it. She was carrying water to the trough one afternoon when Louisa found her, trailing the hem of a new dress through the dust like it cost her nothing to ruin it. "Pa says you've been out here every day with the cowboy." "I've been out here every day with the horse, Louisa. Mr. Hartwell happens to be here, too." "That's not what Ruth says." "Ruth says a lot of things." Louisa's mouth curved, not unkind exactly. More the practiced curve of a woman who'd never once had to work for anyone's good opinion and so had never learned how much it cost other people to earn it. "Silas Danvers came calling again yesterday," Louisa said, changing course the way she always did when a conversation stopped being about her. "Brought Pa a whole crate of good whiskey. Sat in the parlor an hour talking business." Something in Bea went very still. "Danvers came here? He's sweet on me. Or sweet on the ranch. Hard to say which with a man like that." Louisa examined her own reflection in the water bucket, tilting her head one way and then the other. "Handsome enough, I suppose. Rich, certainly. Pa practically falls over himself when that man's boots hit the porch. You should be careful around him." Louisa's eyes flicked up, sharp for once instead of soft. "Careful? Why would I need to be careful? He's one of the wealthiest men in the county. That's not the same as being a good one. And what would you know about it?" It wasn't cruel, quite. Just careless. The particular careless of someone who'd never had to think twice about a compliment before accepting it. "You spend all your time with a horse and a man who's here for me, Bea." Not exactly an expert on suitors. Bea didn't answer that. She picked up the water bucket and walked on toward the trough, and if her hands were gripping the handle harder than the weight required, nobody was there to notice but the horse. Because she knew things about Silas Danvers that Louisa didn't. Things she'd overheard in pieces over years. A word here, a rumor there, never quite enough to prove anything, always enough to leave a bad taste that never fully washed out. And watching her sister float through the yard humming to herself, already halfway in love with a man's money before she'd even properly looked at the man attached to it, Bea felt something cold settle low in her chest. She didn't say anything to Jonas about it that evening, not yet. It wasn't her story to hand over carelessly, not even to him, not even now that some part of her had started, against every instinct she owned, to trust him. That same week, carrying a tray of coffee toward the parlor, Bea stopped outside the half-closed door, because her father's voice had dropped into the low, careful register he only used for money. "Understand the difficulty, Silas, I do. Bad year for cattle prices is all it was. I'll have note settled by spring." "Spring." Danvers's voice smooth as poured oil. "Elias, we've known each other a long while. I'd hate for something as small as a debt to complicate a friendship. It won't. No." A pause. Wait with met something Bea couldn't see but could feel through the door, the particular pressure of a man enjoying the exact moment he had somebody cornered. "It won't. Because I've got a solution in mind that solves your spring's problem rather sooner than spring." Bea's hands went still on the tray. "I've grown fond of your Louisa," Danvers went on. "A match between our families would settle a great many things. Your note, my grazing rights along the North Creek, which I understand your fence line's been disputing. A great many things, Elias. All settled at once, and both of us come out the better for it." Her father's voice, when it came, had a relief in it that made Bea's stomach turn. "I'd be glad to discuss it. Glad indeed." "I thought you might be." Bea backed away from the door before either man could catch her standing there, coffee tray shaking faintly in her hands, and carried it instead to the kitchen where nobody would see her face, doing whatever it was doing. Because her father owed Danvers money, because Danvers wanted more than money now, and because somewhere in that low, patient, satisfied voice on the other side of the door, Bea had heard something that frightened her far more than any wounded stallion ever had. A debt that could be called in whenever a man like that decided the moment was ripe. She didn't know yet what shape that calling in would take. She only knew, with the particular certainty of a woman who'd spent her whole life reading the weather in other people's voices, that it was coming pun, and that when it came, it wouldn't ask anybody's permission first. One sitting on the fence rail with the stars coming up thick and closed the way they only did out past the edge of town, Jonas told her about the war years, the scouting, the border, how he'd lost both parents to a raid when he was 14 and spent the next decade and a half proving to nobody in particular that he could survive on his own, because there hadn't been anybody left to prove it to but himself. Worked other men's land for years, he said, saved every dollar I could hold on to, bought my own place 3 years back, small, but mine. Bea listened, really listened, the way almost nobody in his life had bothered to since his mother died. Why come here, she asked. Why take Pa's bet? Jonas looked down at his hands, torn up, scarred, rope-burned. Hands that had done a lot of work and never once been rewarded with the thing he actually wanted. Because I'm tired, he said. Tired of being alone. Tired of people looking through me like I'm not standing there. He paused. I thought if I could prove myself, maybe I'd deserve something more. Deserve what? He didn't answer right away. Maybe, he said finally. I deserve someone like your sister. Something shifted in Bea's face. Quick, there and gone, like a cloud crossing the sun for exactly 1 second. Then she smiled, except it didn't make it all the way to her eyes. And Jonas, who was starting to notice things about her, the way he'd never bothered noticing things about Louisa, saw the difference, and didn't yet understand why it mattered so much that he had. Louisa doesn't even know your name, Bea said quietly. She will once I tame this horse. Bea slid down off the fence rail. Good luck, Mr. Hartwell. She walked back toward the house, and Jonas sat there in the dark, wondering why her voice had gone thin at the end like that, like something had cracked underneath the words without breaking all the way through. He told himself it didn't mean anything. He told himself that a lot, over the weeks that followed, except it did mean something. That was the trouble, because Jonas started catching himself listening for her boots on the path before the sun went down, started noticing, with a kind of quiet alarm he didn't examine too closely, that his whole day had begun organizing itself around the hour she'd show up at the corral. Started noticing the particular way she checked the horse's water trough with the back of her wrist, out of some old habit, some old carefulness that told him without her ever saying it, in words that somewhere along the way somebody had taught her not to trust her own eyes about anything, temperature included. She wasn't like Louisa, wasn't silk and curls and a laugh built for an audience. She was oat-feed at dusk and never from the left, and a scar on a horse's ribs that she wouldn't name the man who'd left it. She was that was the word that kept surfacing in his head, unhelpful and persistent, like a splinter working its way toward the surface of his palm. One afternoon he rode into town for supplies and saw Louisa pass by in an open carriage, laughing with 3 friends, her dress catching the light exactly the way it had at the fair. The man driving wasn't a friend. Jonas clocked that fast, the old scout's habit of reading a scene before it finished happening. Broad-shouldered, silver at the temples, though. He couldn't have been much past 40, dressed in a way that cost more than Jonas's whole ranch had cost him, a gold watch chain catching the sun like it wanted to be noticed. Mr. Hartwell, the man reined the carriage in, not because he had to, Jonas understood, but because stopping let him look down at people from a height, and looking down at people was clearly a thing he enjoyed. Silas, your little wager. Mr. Danvers. Jonas kept his voice level, kept his hands loose at his sides, the way you kept your hands loose around anything that might strike without warning. Can't say I've heard much about you. Something flickered behind Danvers's eyes. Amusement, mostly the particular amusement of a man unused to not being known. You will. A smile that didn't warm anything. Fine animal, that Stallion. Shame what happened to him before Prescott got hold of him. Some men just don't know how to handle a horse with real spirit in it. Funny, Jonas said. I heard it was you who owned him first. The smile didn't move, but something underneath it did, just for a second. Long enough for Jonas to see it and understand, with the particular clarity of a man who'd spent a decade reading dangerous things quickly, that he'd just made an enemy without meaning to try. Small towns. Danvers said, easy again, like nothing had shifted at all. Everybody's heard something. Louisa glanced at Jonas then, just briefly. The way a person glances at a fence post they've already decided isn't interesting. Then she looked away, and the carriage rolled on, and Jonas stood in the street a moment longer than he needed to, watching the dust settle behind it and thinking that a man who smiled like that while talking about a horse he'd ruined probably smiled the same way about a great many things he'd ruined. Jonas's chest ached, thinking of Louisa sitting so easy beside him, not as much as he'd expected it to. That evening, Bea brought him water and half a loaf of bread without being asked, the way she'd started doing most evenings without either of them commenting on it. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know." She sat beside him in the dirt anyway. They watched the horse together, steady now, mostly, grazing near the far rail like the corral was just a corral and not a battlefield, and for a while neither of them said anything at all. "Why do you help me?" he asked finally. She was quiet long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. "Because you're the first person," she said, "who's ever asked." Jonas looked at her then, really looked, the way a man looks when something in his chest has quietly rearranged itself without asking his permission first. Past the size of her, past the way the whole town had trained itself to look through her like window glass. He saw a woman who fed a wounded animal every single day of her life and never once expected thanks for it because she'd never gotten any. Not for anything. Not once. He saw Bea. But Louisa was still the goal, the dream, the thing he'd walked 20 miles and bled through 3 weeks of rope burns to earn. He told himself that didn't have to change. He was wrong. He just didn't know it yet. The saloon was loud that particular Friday night. Loud in the specific way a room gets loud when the whiskey's cheap and the audience is bored and somebody's decided the evening needs a villain. Jonas had stopped in for one drink. One. He was 3 weeks from the fall deadline and his shoulders ached like an old man's, and he wanted exactly one whiskey and a chair that didn't smell like horse before he rode back out to the ranch. He got neither the piece nor the one drink. A group of men at the corner table were laughing, loud enough to carry over the piano, loud enough that they clearly didn't mind being heard. He caught it in pieces first. Heard Cole spending all his time with the sheriff's giant girl. Poor bastard, probably thinks she'll put in a word with Louisa for him. Or maybe he's just got low standards. Laughter. The kind that fed on itself got louder the longer it went unchallenged. Something in Jonas's chest went very still and very hot at the same time. A stillness he recognized from 10 years of scouting, the particular quiet right before a man decided to do something he couldn't take back. He crossed the room in 3 strides, grabbed the loudest one by his collar, slammed him back against the wall hard enough to rattle the shelf of bottles behind the bar. "Say another word about her." The man's face went the color of old paper. "Didn't mean nothing by it, Hartwell. We was just you did." Jonas's voice didn't rise. "It didn't need to, and if I hear you, or anybody else in this town, disrespect her again, you'll answer to me." He let the man go, walked out into the night without looking back at the room, full of silence he'd left behind him. Word travels fast in a town with nothing better to do than talk, and Bea heard about it the next morning before she'd even finished feeding the horse. Ruth told her, half gleeful, half scandalized, the way Ruth told everything. "Mr. Hartwell about broke a man's jaw over you, Bea. Can you imagine?" Bea couldn't, that was the trouble. She stood at the corral with the feed bucket forgotten at her feet, and her eyes stinging in a way she refused, absolutely refused, to let turn into anything a person could see. Nobody had ever defended her before. Not once. Not her father, not in 20 years, not for anything. But she knew what it was and what it wasn't. She'd learned young how to tell the difference between a man being kind to you and a man being honorable near you, and this was honor. Jonas Hartwell had a code, and the code said you didn't let a woman get spoken about like that in your hearing, and she happened to be standing close enough to benefit from a rule that had nothing to do with her specifically. His heart still belonged to Louisa. She reminded herself of that fact the way you'd to check if it still hurt. It still hurt. Every single time. Her father heard about the saloon too, of course. Everyone heard about the saloon. He brought it up at breakfast over eggs Bea had cooked, and nobody had complimented, in the particular tone he used when he wanted to hurt somebody without technically raising his voice. "Understand your cowboy near broke a man's jaw over you," he said to Bea, not looking up from his plate. "Defending your honor, they're saying in town. I heard. Must be nice." He finally looked at her, and there was nothing warm in it. Nothing like the way he'd looked at Louisa on the platform. Having somebody bother. Bea set down her fork, carefully. The way you set down something when your hand wants to do something else with it entirely. "Would you rather he let them talk, Pa?" "I'd rather," Elias said foots. Standing, done with the conversation, the way he was always done with conversations, that's Thorit, started asking something of him. "You remembered the wager was for Louisa, not you. Don't go getting ideas, Bea. Man, like that's just being decent." Decent men are decent to everybody. Doesn't mean anything. He left the room before she could answer, which was its own kind of answer. The kind Bea had gotten used to receiving from him her whole life. She sat alone at the table a long moment, the eggs going cold, her father's words settling into her chest the way they always did, not fast, not sharp, just slow and heavy, like sediment finding the bottom of a glass. Don't go getting ideas. She almost laughed. Almost. Except laughing at that particular sentence would have meant admitting she'd already gotten one, and admitting that felt more dangerous than anything a black stallion had ever thrown at her. The days ran together after that, one long, unbroken stretch of dawn feedings and evening lessons and a horse that grew calmer by the week, until Bea could hardly remember what the corral had sounded like before it stopped being full of screaming, which was its own kind of strange, watching something heal in front of her, when so much around her stayed exactly stubbornly the same. She still ate dinner at a table where her father's eyes slid past her the way they always had. She still walked into the mercantile to a silence that wasn't really silence, more a held breath waiting for her to leave so the talking could start back up. She still caught her reflection sometimes in the window glass of the general store and had to look away fast, because some habits, the habit of hating what you saw there, didn't unlearn themselves just because a stranger from 20 miles north had started looking at her like she was worth looking at. Except he wasn't looking at her that way. Not really. Not the way that mattered. She told herself that every night, lying awake in the dark with her sister's laughter drifting up through the floorboards from whatever party they were dressing for. He looks at me because I'm useful. He looks at me because I know things about horses he needs to know. That's all it is. That's all it's ever going to be. Because if she let herself believe otherwise, if she let even one corner of her heart start hoping for something bigger than being useful, she'd do exactly how that story ended. She'd watched it end that way her whole life. Hope. And then the particular silence that came after hope got disappointed in front of witnesses, so she kept her voice flat. Kept her distance measured, same as she kept it with the horse. 2 paces. Never closer than 2 paces. Not with Shadow and, without quite admitting it to herself, not with Jonas Hartwell either. Until the evening everything nearly came apart before it had even properly begun. It happened 3 weeks before the fall deadline, on an evening thick with heat that hadn't broken yet even though the sun was most of the way down. Jonas was working the horse at a slow walk around the corral. No rope. Just presence. The way Bea had taught him, and Bea was watching from the rail with her chin propped on crossed arms, and for a while it was almost an ordinary kind of peaceful. Then a ranch hand came around the barn corner, leading a delivery wagon, and the wagon horse spooked at something, and the something turned out to be a rattlesnake, itself too close to the path, and in the 3 seconds of chaos that followed the wagon horse rearing, the hand shouting, dust and noise everywhere, all at once Shadow's old fear came roaring back up out of wherever Jonas and Bea had spent 2 months burying it. The stallion bolted, straight at the rail, straight without meaning to, straight at Bea. Move! Jonas's shout came out of somewhere below, thought, and he was already moving, already throwing himself between the horse and the rail, one hand catching the frayed end of a lead rope that had come loose, hauling with everything 10 years of scouting and 3 years of ranch work had put into his shoulders. The horse reared, screamed, came down inches from where Bea had been standing a half second before she'd thrown herself backward into the dirt. For a moment nobody moved. The dust hung in the air like it didn't know which way to fall. Bea. Jonas's voice cracked clean down the middle. He was at her side before he decided to move, hands hovering over her shoulders, not quite touching, like he was afraid touching might break something that hadn't broken yet. Bea, are you? I'm fine. She was breathing hard, sitting in the dirt with her hair come loose from its tie, staring up at him with an expression he'd never once seen on her face before. Not fear. Something underneath fear. Something startled and raw and entirely unguarded, the look of a woman who'd spent 20 years building a wall and just watched it crack without her permission. You're not fine. You could have... I said I'm fine. But her hands were shaking. He saw them shaking, and something in his chest twisted hard enough to hurt. Neither of them moved for a second too long. Close enough that he could see the dust settled in her eyelashes. Close enough that the whole ranch, the whole town, the whole 3 months of dust and bruises, and Louisa's rose-colored dress seemed to shrink down to just the small distance between his hand and her shoulder. Then the ranch hand called out something about the wagon horse, and the moment broke apart, the way moments do, and Bea scrambled to her feet too fast, brushing dirt off her skirt with hands that still weren't quite steady. I should go, she said. Supper. It's fine, Mr. Hartwell. Formal again, flat again. The wall, going back up brick by brick right in front of him. Truly, I'm fine. She was gone before he could find the words for whatever it was he'd almost said. He stood there in the settling dust with his heart going too hard for a man who hadn't actually been the one in danger. That night, alone in the line shack he'd borrowed for the season, Jonas lay awake staring at a ceiling that had no answers for him. Because it wasn't supposed to be like this. He'd come here for Louisa. Rose-colored dress, dark curls, a face the whole county agreed was the finest in 3 counties. That was the plan. That had always been the plan. The one clean, simple thing he'd let himself want after 15 years of wanting nothing. Because wanting things had only ever gotten him hurt. Except his hands kept remembering the exact weight of Bea's grip, pulling him up out of the dirt, which didn't mean anything. Hands remembered all sorts of things. Didn't have to mean anything at all, except he kept picturing her face in the half-second before the horse reared. Not fear. Something underneath fear. Something that had looked, for just an instant, like she'd stopped expecting the world to catch her. And then it had, and she hadn't known what to do with that. So what? So a man notices things about a woman who's saved his life twice over now, once from a broken infection and once from a horse that would have trampled her flat. That's just gratitude. Gratitude wasn't the same as... He sat up in the dark, annoyed at himself, annoyed at the direction his own thoughts kept dragging him without his permission, like a horse pulling toward water a rider hadn't asked for. Louisa, he told himself. It's Louisa. That's the deal. That's what 3 months of bruised ribs have been for. Except the thought didn't sit right anymore. Hadn't sat right in weeks. If he was honest with himself, which he was trying very hard not to be, because being honest with himself was starting to feel like standing at the edge of something he wasn't ready to fall into. He didn't sleep much that night. In the morning, he told himself it was the coffee. It wasn't the coffee. It was 2 nights later, unable to sleep, that Jonas rode into the far pasture where old Amos Kittredge kept a line shack and a bad hip and better memory than most men half his age. He hadn't meant to go looking for anything. He'd meant to ride, to burn off the restlessness that had been sitting in his chest since the rattlesnake evening, since Bea's shaking hands, since a dozen small things he didn't have names for yet. But Amos was sitting out on his porch step with a pipe and a bottle, the way he did most nights, and when Jonas mentioned casual, too casual, he'd think later that he was working the black stallion up at the Prescott place. The old man's face did something complicated. That the horse Danvers sold off, Jonas went still. Silas Danvers, big rancher out past the East Ridge, owns half the good grazing land in the county. Amos took a long pull from his pipe, eyes gone distant with old memory. Bought that stallion off a family passing through, must be 5 years back now. Homesteaders, immigrants, foreign accent, hardly spoke the language good enough to argue with a man like Danvers. What happened to them? What always happens? Amos spat off the porch. Danvers wanted their water rights. Land wasn't worth much without water, so he made him an offer that wasn't really an offer. And when the husband balked, well, a long pause. Man had an accident with his own plow horse, is what the story went. Family sold out cheap after that and moved on. Nobody ever saw him again. You believe that, the accident? Amos looked at him sideways, the kind of look a man gives you when he's deciding how much truth you can carry. I believe, he said slowly, that Silas Danvers has had 3 separate accidents happen to 3 separate men who stood between him and something he wanted. I believe that's a mighty strange run of bad luck for everybody but him. He tapped his pipe out against the porch rail, and I believe a smart man doesn't say that too loud in this county. Danvers owns the bank, owns the freight line, near enough. Owns a fair share of the men who'd be sitting on any jury that ever tried him for anything. Then, nothing's ever been proved. Amos's voice went flat, tired in a way that had nothing to do with the late hour. There's a difference, son, and it's a difference that's kept men like Danvers sleeping easy their whole lives. And the horse, that devil stallion, Danvers kept him a season, tried to break him himself, whipped him raw when he wouldn't take a saddle, sold him off to Prescott for a laugh, from what I heard. Prescott thought a mean-looking horse might impress Muddy at the fair someday. Why'd he sell him, if he'd already ruined the family that owned him? Why not just keep the horse too? Amos shrugged. An old man's shrug, the kind that had stopped being surprised by human cruelty decades back. Man like that don't keep broken things around long. Reminds him too much of what he broke. He looked at Jonas a long moment, something almost like warning in his weathered face. You be careful nosing around in Danvers' business, Mr. Hartwell. Man's buried worse things than a horse's temper. Don't much care for people who go digging. Jonas sat very still on his own porch step, borrowed for the evening, staring out at a darkness that suddenly had a lot more shape to it than it had 5 minutes earlier. Because if that was true, If Shadow's scars traced back not just to cruelty but to a man who'd ruined a family to get a piece of land, a man who was still out there, still respected, still shaking hands at church on Sundays, then this wasn't just a story about a horse anymore. And Bea knew something. He was sure of it now, thinking back on the way her face had shut like a door every time the subject came close. She knew or suspected or had heard enough pieces of it over the years to have built her own quiet, private picture of exactly what kind of man Silas Danvers was, which meant she'd been carrying that alone. For who knew how long? Jonas rode home slow that night, the reins loose in his torn-up hands, and for the first time since he'd stood in that town square and accepted a sheriff's cruel little wager, he found himself thinking less about Louisa's rose dress and more about a woman who hummed to a wounded horse and never once asked anybody to notice her doing it. He didn't know yet what he was going to do with that thought. He only knew it wasn't going away. The next morning, Bea was at the corral before he arrived, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the way she looked up when he came around the barn, something guarded and searching in her face like she'd been waiting to see what expression he'd be wearing. "You're up early," she said. "Couldn't sleep." "Neither could I." They stood a moment in the kind of silence that had weight to it now, that hadn't had weight 2 months ago when they were still strangers, circling each other with careful distance. "Bea." He said her name slow, testing it, the way you test ice before you put your full weight on it. "Who's Silas Danvers to you?" Her whole body went still. Not the careful stillness she used around the horse. Something more like the stillness of a person who's just heard a door they thought was locked click quietly open. "Where'd you hear that name?" "Amos Kittredge." She looked away from him, out toward the ridge where, he now understood, Danvers's land began somewhere past the horizon line. Her jaw worked once, twice, like she was chewing on whether the truth was safe to hand over. "He's the reason Shadow has that scar," she said finally, quiet. "And he's the reason a family doesn't live in this county anymore. And if you're smart, Mr. Hartwell, you'll leave it there. Man like that doesn't forgive people for knowing things about him." "Do you know things about him?" Her eyes met his. Something old and tired and frightened moved behind them, gone as quickly as it had come, tucked back down wherever she kept things too heavy to carry around in daylight. "I know enough," she said, "to know it isn't my story to tell yet." She turned back to the horse before he could push further, picking up the feed bucket like the conversation had never happened, and Jonas understood the way you understand weather changing. Before the first drop falls, that whatever she was carrying, she wasn't ready to set it down. Not yet, but she would. He could feel it coming. The way you feel a storm building pressure days before the sky finally breaks. Summer bled slowly into the first cool edges of fall, and the stallion that had once tried to kill 3 trainers now let Bea run a hand along its neck without so much as a flinch. Let Jonas stand at its shoulder, close enough to feel its breath, close enough to whisper the low, wordless hum Bea had taught him without either of them ever calling it a lesson in anything but horses. He hadn't told her about riding out to see Amos again, hadn't pushed her further on Danvers, but something had settled between them in the weeks since, a knowing, unspoken and mutual, that they were circling something larger than a horse and a wager. Something that involved a scar, and a family nobody talked about anymore, and a rich man's name that made Bea's whole body go rigid every time it came up. One evening, close enough to the deadline, now that Jonas could feel it in his chest like a held breath, Bea sat beside him on the fence rail and said, without preamble, the way she said most important things, "I wasn't always this brave with him." Jonas turned. "With Shadow? When Pa first brought him home, he was going to have the hands put him down. Said a horse that mean wasn't worth the feed." Her voice had gone, somewhere far away, somewhere younger. "I snuck out here in the middle of the night. Sat outside that fence for hours just talking to him. Not humming yet. Just talking. Telling him nobody was going to shoot him while I had breath in my body to stop it." Jonas felt something in his chest crack open, slow and total. "You saved him. I hid feed for him for 2 weeks before Pa even knew I was doing it. Told the hands I'd take care of him myself so nobody'd get hurt trying. It wasn't bravery." She looked down at her hands, work roofing, strong. "It was just I looked at him, screaming and kicking at that fence, and I thought, that's what it looks like. When something's been hurt so bad it doesn't know how to be anything but dangerous anymore. And I thought, somebody ought to try. Even if it doesn't work, somebody ought to try." Jonas didn't say anything for a long moment. He didn't trust his own voice yet. "Somebody did try," he said finally. "You did." Bea looked up at him, and, in the fading light, for just a second, she didn't look like a woman who'd spent 20 years being looked through. She looked like exactly what she was. The reason a killer horse had learned how to be gentle again. The reason Jonas Hartwell, 3 weeks from a deadline that would decide the rest of his life, was starting to understand that everything he thought he wanted had been standing quietly at this corral the whole time, feeding a wounded animal nobody else had bothered to save. He just wasn't ready to say that out loud yet. Not with Louise's name still sitting unspoken between them like a debt he hadn't figured out how to stop owing. The night before the final week began, Jonas found Bea at the corral later than usual, the moon high and full over the ridge, shadows standing calm and silver-edged in the pale light, like an entirely different animal than the one that had tried to kill him 3 months back. Couldn't sleep either, he said, coming to stand beside her at the rail. Never sleep well this close to fall. She didn't look at him. Watched the horse instead, the way she always did when a conversation was heading somewhere. She wasn't sure she wanted it to go. Too much waiting in a house that's never been patient with me. Bea, he turned to face her properly. There's something I keep meaning to say. Her whole body went still, the particular stillness of a person below that might, this once, not come. What, he opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Because how did a man say it? How did a man stand in front of the woman who'd taught him everything he knew about patience and courage, and not giving up on something wounded, and tell her that somewhere in 3 months of dust and rope burns, the plan had quietly stopped being the plan, that the dream he'd walked 20 miles with had gotten smaller and smaller the longer he stood next to something realer. Except saying it now, 3 weeks before the wager came due, felt like handing her something he had no right to hand over yet. Not while Louise's name still hung over both of them. Not while he hadn't earned the right to want something different than what he'd promised the whole town he was riding toward. Thank you, he said instead, and hated himself a little for the smallness of it. For everything you've taught me. I wouldn't have made it this far without you. Something in Bea's face did a complicated thing, hope rising and then folding itself back down before it could fully unfurl. Practiced and quick, the way she'd learned to do with every hope that had ever come near her. That's what I'm here for, she said, flat again. The wall going back up, brick by careful brick, making sure you win your bet. Bea, that's late, Mr. Hartwell. She was already stepping back from the rail. You'll want to be rested, big week coming. She wanted to tell him about Danvers, about the parlor, and the debt, and the low, satisfied voice that had made her hands shake around a coffee tray. She wanted to warn him that whatever was coming wasn't going to be as simple as a horse and a handshake, that her father owed a dangerous man money, and dangerous men rarely forgot to collect. But the words stayed lodged behind her teeth, same place they always stayed, because handing somebody the truth meant trusting. They'd still be standing there once they had it, and Beatrice Prescott had never once in her whole life gotten to trust that particular thing and keep it. So she walked back toward the house instead, and Jonas watched her go, and neither one of them said the thing that mattered most. And somewhere past the ridge, a man who owned half the county's water rights slept easy in a house built on other people's ruin, entirely unbothered by how close his name had come, twice now, to being spoken out loud by the two people who would eventually be the ones to bring it all down around him. Fall was 3 weeks out. The wager still stood. And somewhere past the East Ridge, a man named Silas Danvers went on living his comfortable life, entirely unaware that the horse he'd broken and discarded was about to become the reason his sins came looking for him at last. Bea didn't know it yet either, not the whole shape of what was coming, but something in her had started quietly, carefully, the way she did everything, to hope. And hope, for a woman who'd spent her whole life being taught not to, was the most dangerous thing of all. The last week went by too fast and not fast enough, both at once, the way the last week of anything important always does. Jonas barely slept, not from fear anymore. Something else now, something that had crept in slow over 3 months and taken up residence somewhere behind his ribs without asking permission first, because the horse was ready. He knew it, the way a man knows weather changing in his bones. Shadow would walk up to him now without being called, would let him run a hand down that long black neck over the old scar without so much as a flinch. Except being ready didn't make Jonas feel ready, not for what came after, because ready for a horse and ready for a wedding turned out to be two entirely different kinds of ready, and no amount of practice in a corral had prepared him for the second kind at all. He kept catching himself watching Bea instead of the horse, watching the particular way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear when she was thinking hard about something she wasn't saying out loud, watching the small, private smile she didn't seem to know she was wearing when Shadow nuzzled her shoulder, looking for oats she didn't have on her that day. Louise's face had gotten harder to picture lately, which frightened him more than the horse ever had, because a man was supposed to know his own heart, supposed to be able to say with some confidence who exactly he was walking toward a wager for. And Jonas Hartwell 3 days out from the biggest morning of his adult life, found himself lying awake running through every reason he'd first accepted Beatrice Prescott's cruel little bet and coming up, more and more, with an answer that had nothing to do with rose-colored silk at all. Except it couldn't be that. Could it? He'd built 3 months of purpose around one clear goal, and a man didn't just wake up one gray Tuesday and discover the goal had quietly rearranged itself into someone else entirely. Did he? He didn't have an answer by morning. He rode out to the corral anyway, because the horse still needed working, whether or not his own heart had made up its mind, and found Bea already there, sleeves rolled, humming that same low tune, and something in his chest settled just looking at her. That, he thought, might have been answer enough all along. Bea didn't sleep much either that last week, though for reasons she kept locked down tight, where nobody could get at them, herself included, most days. Because in 6 days Jonas Hartwell would ride that horse into the square and win himself a wife. And the wife he'd win wasn't going to be her. It was never going to be her. She'd known that from the first morning at the corral. Known it the way you know, son's going to set, and even though it hadn't stopped one single treacherous corner of her heart from hoping, anyway. Hope, that word again. She'd tried so hard to starve it out of herself, and it kept coming back anyway, stubborn as a weed in a garden nobody watered. So she did what she'd always done with feelings too big and too dangerous to keep looking at directly. She put her head down, worked, fed the horse, mended tack, made herself useful right up until the morning the wager came due, because useful was a thing she knew how to be, and heartbroken was a thing she'd never once let herself practice out loud. The morning of the taming, Ironwood Hollow woke up buzzing. Word had traveled the way it always traveled in a town with nothing better to do. The Cowboys actually done it. Tamed the devil horse. Come see for yourself. By mid-morning, the square was packed tighter than it had been for the fair itself. Men leaned against the mercantile porch rail 3 deep. Women fanned themselves in the growing heat, gossiping behind gloved hands. Sheriff Elias Prescott stood on the same wooden platform, same vest, same thumbs hooked in the same self-satisfied posture, except something had shifted behind his eyes since the spring. A tightness. A man doing arithmetic he didn't like the answer to. Louisa stood beside him in emerald green this time, bored and radiant in equal measure, fanning herself with a lace fan that had cost more than most ranch hands made in a month. Ruth flanked her other side, equally uninterested, already whispering to a friend about something that had nothing to do with the day's events. And near the back of the crowd, almost swallowed by the press of bodies, stood Bea, plain cotton dress, hair simply tied, watching the way she'd watched everything her whole life, from just close enough to see and just far enough to not be seen seeing. Jonas led Shadow into the square. The crowd's noise died in stages, like a fire being smothered a handful of dirt at a time, because the horse walking beside him wasn't the horse anybody remembered. Coat gleaming black in the sun, ears forward, eyes steady, calm, entirely unbothered by the crowd or the noise, or the 300 strangers watching to see if he'd finally kill somebody. That can't be the same horse, a woman near the front whispered. He actually did it, someone else murmured, disbelief thick in every word. Jonas didn't look at the crowd, didn't look for Louisa, though a part of him noted, distantly, that he wasn't looking for her the way he'd expected he would be. He kept his focus where it mattered. One hand resting light on Shadow's neck, the other holding the reins loose, barely a suggestion of control, because control had never been the point. Trust had been the point. Elias stepped down off the platform, eyebrows climbing toward his hairline. Well, he said, loud enough for the crowd to hear, though something underneath the words had gone thin and careful. I'll be damned you got a rope on him. I did more than that. Jonas swung himself up onto the stallion's back. The whole square held its breath at once. 300 people forgetting to exhale, and for one long suspended second Shadow's muscles bunched beneath him like the horse might. After everything, decide this particular morning was the morning to remember. Remember he used to be a killer. Then Jonas leaned forward, murmured something low, wordless, the tune that belonged to nobody but him and Bea, and a horse that had finally stopped being afraid. Shadow relaxed. Jonas walked him forward, slow, easy, guiding him in a wide circle around the square, while the crowd stood frozen in a silence that had nothing left of mockery in it. Then a trot, smooth, controlled. Then, because he couldn't help himself, because some part of him wanted the whole town to see exactly what 3 months of patience could build, where 3 trainers and a whip had only ever built rage. A canter, powerful and easy, the black coat catching the light like poured ink. Crowd erupted, cheering now. Real cheering, the kind that had forgotten in the space of one perfect circle around a dusty square, that it had spent all spring and summer betting against this exact outcome. Jonas rode back to the platform, dismounted, handed the reins to a waiting ranch hand, and Shadow stood there placid as a plow horse. And somewhere in the crowd, Bea pressed one hand hard against her own mouth to keep something from coming out of it that had no business coming out in front of 300 people. Jonas turned to face the sheriff, squared his shoulders. 3 months of bruised ribs and split knuckles, and a heart that had quietly, without asking his permission, changed its mind about what it wanted. All of it distilled down into 6 words. "I've kept my end of the deal." His voice carried, steady across the whole silent square. "Now keep yours," the sheriff called. Just for a heartbeat. Just long enough for the crowd, sharp as any crowd ever is about sensing weakness, to lean in a fraction closer, waiting. Because Elias Prescott had a problem that morning, and it wasn't the horse. The horse had been the easy part. The problem was standing 30 feet away in emerald green, and the problem's real fiancé, a fact the whole town would learn soon enough, though not soon enough to save what happened next, was watching from beneath the mercantile awning, with his arms crossed and his expression giving nothing away at all. Elias glanced at Louisa, then back at Jonas. The whole town watching, waiting, and no way now to back out of a deal struck in front of every witness that mattered. "A deal's a deal," Elias said slowly, each word dragged out of him like a splinter. He turned, gestured toward his daughters, and the crowd murmured with anticipation, already certain of what came next, already picturing the rose-colored dress, and the dark curls and the fine wedding that would follow. His hand moved past Louisa, past Ruth, and pointed instead toward the back of the crowd. "Bea, get up here." The murmur turned to something else entirely, a gasp first, sharp and collective, then confusion. Then, because a crowd that size never stays confused for long, when there's cruelty to be found in the confusion, laughter, low and building, spreading outward from the platform like a stain. "He said his daughter," someone whispered, delighted with the discovery. "He didn't say which one," someone else answered, and the laughter climbed another notch. Bea stood frozen at the back of the square. For one long moment her whole body simply refused to move, locked in place by 300 pairs of eyes, sudden finally, looking directly at her, and none of it, not one single glance, was the kind of looking she'd ever once let herself want. "Come on, girl." Her father's voice boomed across the square, jovial now, performing for the crowd the way he always performed. "Don't be shy." More laughter. Somebody near the front slapped his own knee. A woman covered her mouth with a gloved hand, eyes bright with the particular malicious delight that comes free with public humiliation, no ticket required. Bea forced her legs to move. Each step felt like walking into a wind that didn't exist, some invisible weight pressing against her chest with every foot of ground she covered. The crowd parted for her the way crowds part for exactly 2 things: respect or spectacle, and she'd lived 20 years in Ironwood Hollow, long enough to know exactly which one this was. She climbed onto the platform. Her father's hand closed around her arm, too tight, pulling her forward like a prize livestock entry, rather than a daughter, presenting her to Jonas with a flourish that turned the whole moment into exactly the joke the crowd had already decided it was. "You wanted a daughter, Cowboy." Elias's voice, carrying, cruel, performing right up until the very last word. "Here she is, my daughter." The square exploded into laughter. Men doubled over. Women pressed handkerchiefs to their mouths, shoulders shaking. Somewhere in the noise, Louisa turned her face away, embarrassed even to be standing near the spectacle, and Ruth didn't bother hiding her own giggle behind her fan at all. Bea stood on that platform with her head bowed, tears running silent and hot down her face, and every single humiliation of every single year she'd survived in this town seemed to gather itself up into this one unbearable moment and press down on her chest until she could hardly breathe around it. Jonas stared at the sheriff, then at Bea. Something in his chest cracked open, wide and furious, flooding through him so fast and so total it took him a moment to find his own voice underneath it. Because he'd worked 3 months for this, bled for it, broken every bone in his own careful patience, learning to earn a wild animal's trust, 1 inch at a time, and the whole town, every single one of them, had just turned it into a punchline at the exact moment it should have meant something. He looked at Louisa, radiant, relieved, plainly, visibly relieved, that she wasn't the one being handed over like a cruel joke. His dream, the one he'd carried 20 miles in 3 months, simply stopped, like a clock somebody had reached in and quietly stilled the pendulum of. Then he looked at Bea's face, the tears, the shame, the particular bowed posture of a woman who had spent her entire life being told, in 1,000 small silent ways, that she wasn't worth the looking. She didn't deserve this. He had a choice technically. He could refuse, walk off the platform, lose his honor, lose his standing in a town he'd have to keep living near for the rest of his working life, prove every single person laughing right now correct about exactly what kind of fool he was. Except it wasn't really a choice at all. Not once he looked at her face. He stepped forward. The laughter thinned, uncertain now, 300 people watching to see what the fool was going to do next. He reached out, gently lifted Bea's chin with 2 fingers, forcing her reddened eyes up to meet his, and when he spoke his voice rang out clear across the whole silent square, steady in a way that surprised even him. "You think you've shamed me?" He turned to face the crowd, every laughing mouth, every gleeful gloved hand. "She's the reason I tamed that horse." His voice didn't shake, not luck, not skill I already had. "She taught me everything I know, every single lesson. While the rest of you sat on your porches placing bets against me." Silence now. Total silence. The kind that comes when a crowd realizes, too late, that the joke has turned, and they're the ones standing exposed in it. "She's worth more," Jonas said, "than every one of you combined." He turned back to Bea. His voice dropped, softened, meant for her alone, though the whole square could still hear it. "And I'll honor my word." Bea's eyes went wide. Tears spilled over faster now, except something had shifted in them, confusion tangled up with disbelief, because underneath the honor in his voice, she heard something else too. Something that sounded, if she let herself hope for even one more terrible second, almost like resolve chosen freely rather than duty accepted grudgingly, except she couldn't quite believe that. Not yet. Not with his eyes still carrying, somewhere underneath the kindness, a flicker of the same bitterness she'd learned to recognize not in every mirror that had ever shown her a face the world decided wasn't enough. He was choosing honor, not her. She told herself that firmly, the way you tell yourself something true, so it doesn't have room to slide sideways into something you want more. Jonas took her hand. "Come on," he said quietly. He led her down off the platform, through a crowd too stunned to do anything but part and stare, and behind them the whispers started up again almost before they'd cleared the square. "Poor fool. Thought he'd get Louisa. Sheriff played him good. That marriage won't last a year." Bea heard every word. So did. Neither one of them said anything at all as they walked toward a future neither of them had asked for, in exactly the shape it had come to them in. They walked all the way to the edge of town before either one of them spoke. Because what was there to say? What sentence existed that could hold everything that had just happened? The crowd's laughter, and her father's cruelty, and a stranger's sudden, fierce defense of her, all tangled together into one impossible afternoon. "You didn't have to do that," Bea said finally, staring straight ahead at the road. "Do what? Defend me? In front of everybody?" "Yes, I did." "No." She stopped walking, turned to face him, arms wrapped tight around herself. "You didn't. You could have walked away. Everybody would have understood. My own father set you up to fail, Jonas. Nobody would have blamed you for refusing. I'd have blamed myself." "Why?" He was quiet a moment, searching for the honest answer underneath the easy one. "Because you spent 3 months teaching me things nobody else bothered to teach me," he said finally. "Because you pulled me out of the dirt more times than I can count, and never once asked for anything back. And because, standing on that platform, watching you get handed over like some kind of consolation prize." His jaw tightened. That wasn't right. Whatever else is true about today, that wasn't right. And I wasn't going to stand there and let it be the last word. Bea studied his face a long moment, searching for the lie in it, the performance, the thing men usually hid underneath kindness when they wanted something. She didn't find one, which frightened her more than finding one would have. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted, quiet, the words costing her something to hand over. "Be somebody's wife. I never thought I'd get the chance." "Neither do I," Jonas said. "Not really. Not the way I'd planned it anyhow." Something in that admission, small and honest, eased a fraction of the tightness in Bea's chest. "Then I suppose," she said, "we'll have to figure it out as we go." "Suppose we will." They walked on toward the ranch in silence after that, but it was a different silence than the one that had carried them out of the square. Less like a wall, more like 2 people standing at the edge of the same uncertain water, working up the nerve to wade in together. The wedding happened 4 days later, quick and small, because a promise made in front of 300 witnesses didn't leave much room for a longer engagement. Except the town had barely caught its breath from the platform scandal, before an entirely different piece of news started moving through it, mouth to mouth, faster than any fire could have spread. Because 2 days before Bea's wedding, Silas Danvers rode into the square with a ring box in his coat pocket and an announcement that landed on Ironwood Hollow like a second, sharper kind of thunder. He and Louisa Prescott had been secretly engaged since spring. Since spring, which meant the whole wager, the whole cruel spectacle on that platform, every single ounce of hope, Jonas had carried 20 miles in 3 months to win. None of it had ever been real to begin with. Louisa had never been available to win. Not since a night back in April when Danvers had slipped a ring onto her finger in the privacy of her father's parlor and sworn her to silence until the timing suited him better. Suited him better, Bea repeated flatly, when she heard, standing in the kitchen with a dish towel gripped so hard her knuckles had gone pale. Suited him, Jonas said, meaning suited whatever he was already planning. Father, the debt, the land, because it clicked into place now, ugly and complete, the whole shape of it. Elias hadn't offered Louisa at the fair by accident, and he hadn't panicked into offering Bea instead either. Danvers had already claimed Louisa months before the wager was ever struck, which meant the sheriff's grand prize on that platform had been from the very first morning a woman who was never his to give. He knew, Bea said, quiet, something cold settling into her voice. Pa knew the whole time. He offered a bride he didn't even have a right to promise, and when he couldn't deliver her, he handed over the one he could. Bea set the towel down, careful, deliberate, because I was never going to say no, because I never get asked. I just get handed over. Jonas didn't have an answer for that. There wasn't one that wouldn't have sounded hollow coming out of his mouth. Not yet. Not while some part of him was still working through the wreckage of a dream he'd carried a very long way only to learn. It had never once been real. Except he noticed, standing there in that kitchen, watching Bea's jaw set hard against the humiliation of it all, that the wreckage didn't hurt quite as much as it should have, which frightened him more than almost anything had all summer. The wedding, when it came, was small enough to fit inside a single Sunday afternoon. The town preacher officiated because the town preacher married everybody, regardless of circumstance, and 2 witnesses stood in because the law required 2 witnesses, and nobody in Ironwood Hollow had volunteered for the honor. Elias Prescott didn't attend, sent word he had business in the next county that couldn't wait, which fooled exactly nobody, least of all his own daughter. Louisa sent a note instead of coming herself. 4 words in her fine looping hand, congratulations, nothing more. Bea wore a plain dress, pale blue, the nicest thing she owned, though it wouldn't have turned a single head at the fair. Jonas wore his cleanest shirt, the collar a little frayed at the edge, no matter how many times he'd tried to press it smooth. They said the vows. Standard words, the same words every couple in that church had said for 40 years, except they landed strange and hollow in Bea's ears, like hearing your own name shouted back at you across a canyon, familiar and distorted both at once. You may kiss the bride, the preacher said. Jonas hesitated. It was only a second, maybe 2, but Bea felt it the way you feel a held breath, and something in her chest sank low and quiet, because a groom who truly wanted his bride didn't hesitate, not even for a second, not even for half of one. He leaned in, kissed her cheek, brief, careful, respectful in every way that mattered and entirely absent of everything she'd secretly, foolishly, hopelessly wanted it to carry. It was enough to make the marriage legal. It wasn't enough to make it feel like anything but what it was. Jonas's ranch was small, wooden cabin, a barn that needed a new roof before winter. A few acres of grazing land he'd built up dollar by careful dollar over 3 hard years. Bea moved in with a single trunk of belongings because a single trunk was all 20 years in her father's house had ever left her free to call her own. She tried. Nobody could have said she didn't try. She cooked meals that went eaten in near silence. She tended a garden that had been half wild when she arrived, and coaxed it, within a month, into neat rows that would have made any ranch wife in the county proud. She worked with the horses, and worked well, better in some ways than Jonas did, and still Jonas remained careful with her, polite, distant in the particular way a man is distant when he's trying very hard not to hurt somebody he already suspects he's hurting anyway. He thanked her for meals, never raised his voice, never once said an unkind word to her, not in all the weeks that followed. He also never once reached for her in the dark. They slept on opposite sides of the same narrow bed, backs turned, a careful measured distance between them that neither one crossed. Some nights Bea heard him sigh into the darkness, long and low, and she knew because she'd spent her whole life learning to read exactly this kind of silence, precisely what that sigh meant. I should have had Louisa. I earned her. I deserve better than this. She never said it out loud. She didn't have to. She'd heard it enough times, in enough houses, from enough people, that she didn't need the words spoken to recognize the shape of them lying awake beside her every single night. A month into the marriage, Bea rode into town for supplies. Because somebody had to, and it clearly wasn't going to stop being her just because she'd changed her name. The moment she stepped into the general store, the room went quiet in that particular way. Rooms went quiet around her now. Not the old quiet, the looking away kind, sharper, amused, Well, if it isn't Mrs. Hartwell. Mrs. Calloway's smile stretched thin bright as a wire pulled taut. How's married life treating you, dear? Fine, thank you. Must be hard. A friend beside her leaned in, voice pitched to carry exactly as far as it needed to and not 1 inch further. Knowing your husband wanted your sister. Poor man, another voice, delighted with itself. Worked himself half to death for that horse and ended up. A pause, wet with meaning. Well, laughter. Bright and cruel and entirely at home in a room full of women who'd spent their whole lives practicing exactly this particular tone. Bea paid for her flour and her coffee with hands that didn't shake because she'd trained them a long time ago not to, and walked out into the street with her chin level and her eyes dry, because crying in front of that store's window would have been handing them one more thing to talk about over supper. She didn't tell Jonas what happened when she got home. What would have been the point? He already knew, in the broad shape of things, what the town was saying. Telling him the specific words wouldn't have changed anything, except giving them one more evening's worth of weight to carry between them. Jonas found out anyway, not from Bea, from Dutch, who still worked the Prescott spread but rode past the Hartwell place often enough on other business, and who mentioned it offhand one afternoon while helping mend a fence, the way men mention things they don't realize are going to land like a blow. Town's still talking about your wedding, Dutch said, working a nail loose from an old post. Giving your wife a hard time of it, from what I hear. Mrs. Calloway and that lot. Jonas went still. Hammer paused mid-swing. What kind of hard time? The usual kind women give each other when they've decided somebody's fair game. Dutch shrugged, not unkind, just matter-of-fact about a cruelty he'd apparently seen play out 100 times before and stopped being surprised by. She didn't say nothing about it to you? No. Wouldn't figure she would. Dutch pulled the nail free, examined it, tossed it aside. That one spent her whole life learning not to hand people things they might use against her later. Doesn't come natural to her, telling somebody when she's hurting. Jonas set the hammer down slow. Something in his chest had gone tight and hot, the same particular anger he'd felt on that platform, except this time there was nowhere to put it. No crowd to speak to. No single moment to stand up in front of and make right. Just a wife across the supper table eating in silence, carrying something alone that he hadn't even known enough to ask her about. That evening, he watched her more closely than he had in weeks. Watched the careful way she moved through the small kitchen, efficient, contained, like a woman who'd trained every inch of herself not to take up more room than absolutely necessary. Bea, he said her name into the quiet of the meal. Town giving you trouble? Her hands went still over the stew pot for exactly 1 second, then resumed, smooth as though they'd never stopped at all. No more than usual. That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got. She set his bowl down in front of him without meeting his eyes. Eat your supper, Jonas. It's getting cold. He ate. Didn't push further, though something in him wanted to, badly, wanted to march back into that general store and say the same thing he'd said off the platform 6 weeks ago, loud enough that this time it might actually stick. Except he'd already said it once, and it hadn't changed a single thing about how this town treated her. Because towns, he was learning slowly and painfully, didn't change their minds about a person just because somebody stood up once and told them to. One evening, close to 2 months in, Jonas rode into town on an errand that didn't take because the feed store had already closed and he'd misjudged the hour, and on his way back through the square he saw Louisa. She stood outside the mercantile in a new dress, laughing with a cluster of well-dressed men, wealthy ranchers and merchants, who orbited her the way moths orbit a lit window. She looked radiant. Untouchable, the way she always had, the exact picture Jonas had carried in his chest for 3 long months of bruised ribs and rope burns. One of the men said something. Louisa threw her head back and laughed bright and easy, entirely unbothered by anything at all. Jonas's chest ached watching her. That should have been my life. Some old worn part of him thought, automatic as a reflex, before he'd even decided to think it. Except the thought arrived and then just sat there, hollow. Like trying on a coat that used to fit and finding it hung wrong on his shoulders now, too tight in places that it used to feel comfortable, too loose in others he hadn't noticed before. He turned his horse without buying what he'd come for, and rode home instead, and the whole way back he found himself thinking not of Louisa's laugh but of Bea's hands, steady and sure, guiding a wounded animal back toward trust 1 patient inch at a time. He didn't understand yet what that meant. He was getting closer to understanding, though, whether he was ready for it or not. Weeks turned into months, and the ranch, whatever else it lacked, did not lack for work. Bea proved herself skilled with the horses in ways that went beyond anything she'd learned at her father's corral. She trained the young stock alongside Jonas, often finishing faster and gentler than he did, and word of it began slowly to creep out past the edges of the property. A rancher 2 farms over sent word, asking if the Hartwell wife might look at a mare that wouldn't take a bridle. Bea rode out, fixed it in an afternoon, and rode home with a silver dollar in her pocket, and something that might, if she'd let herself name it, have been called pride. Jonas noticed. Of course he noticed. But noticing and saying so were still, for him, 2 very separate countries with a long uncrossed border between them. One afternoon, a rancher's wife named Mrs. Odom rode out to the property herself, rather than sending word through her husband, which struck Bea as unusual enough that she nearly didn't recognize what was happening until the woman was halfway through explaining it. "My gelding's gone lame in the off-4," Mrs. Odom said, standing awkward at the gate, clearly unused to asking a Prescott-turned-Hartwell for anything at all. "Vet in town says there's nothing wrong with the leg itself. Wondered if you might take a look. Heard you've got a gift for reading what's actually troubling an animal underneath what looks wrong on the surface." Bea looked at her a long moment, searching the woman's face for the mockery she'd learned to expect from every corner of this town. She didn't find any, just an ordinary woman with an ordinary problem, asking for help the plain, uncomplicated way people ask for help from somebody they trust to give it. "I'll take a look," Bea said. It took her 20 minutes to find it. Not the leg at all, but an old ill-fitting saddle rubbing a sore spot the horse had learned to favor, shifting its whole gait to avoid the pain, until even the leg itself had started compensating wrong. She showed Mrs. Odom exactly where to pad the saddle, exactly how to check for it going forward, and the woman left with her horse-walking sound, and her opinion of Bea Hartwell visibly, permanently altered. Word of that spread too, the way word always did in a small town, except this particular word carried something Bea had never once in her life had the town hand her before. Respect, plain and unglamorous, but real. One evening, close to the 3-month mark of the marriage, Bea woke to find the other side of the bed empty. She lay still a moment, listening, and then rose, quiet, and went to the window. Jonas sat outside on the porch steps, silhouetted against a wide field of stars, shoulders bowed forward in a way she'd never once seen him carry them in daylight. She heard him talking, low, half to himself and half to something larger than himself, the particular murmuring men do when they think nobody's listening. "I did everything right." His voice rough, tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "I worked, I fought, I proved myself." A long pause, the kind that has weight in it even from a distance. "And this is what I get. A wife I didn't choose, a life I didn't." Bea's hand rose to her mouth without her telling it to. She stepped back from the window before he could sense her there, and stood in the dark of the small bedroom with her whole chest folding in on itself, slow and complete, like a house settling after a long, hard winter. She'd known. Of course she'd known, the way you always know the shape of a thing before somebody says it plainly. But there was a particular, specific cruelty in hearing it confirmed in his own voice, unguarded, meant for nobody but the stars. And Bea stood there a long time before she found her way back to a bed she now had to share with a man who'd just told the night sky he didn't want her in it. The next evening, Bea almost told him he could go. She'd rehearsed it most of the day, moving through her chores with the particular careful concentration of a woman keeping her hands busy so her mind wouldn't wander someplace it couldn't return from. By supper she had the words ready, lined up neat as fence posts. Except when she opened her mouth to say them, Jonas was already looking at her in a way that made the words falter before they'd even cleared her teeth. "Something on your mind?" he asked. She stopped. "Started again. I heard you last night." On the porch, his face went still. "I wasn't listening on purpose," she said quickly. I know you didn't choose this, Jonas. I know you still think about her. But you don't have to explain it." Her voice wavered, and she hated that it did. Hated handing him one more piece of her that wasn't steady. "I just want you to know. If you ever need to go, I won't hold it against you." For a long moment he didn't answer. Because what was there to say to that exactly? That wouldn't sound like a promise he wasn't sure yet he had the right to make. He thought of Louisa. Found, strangely, that the thought didn't hurt the way it used to, and didn't know yet what to do with a hurt that had gone quiet without his permission. He thought of Bea's hands pulling him up out of the dirt, of a horse's nose pressed warm against his palm, because she'd taught him how to earn that kind of trust one patient inch at a time. "I don't want you to go," he said finally. It wasn't everything. It wasn't the whole truth sitting behind his ribs. Not yet, because some truths needed more room to grow into themselves before a man trusted his own voice to carry them right. But it was more than either of them had said out loud. In 3 months of careful distance, And Bea held on to those 5 words the way you hold on to the first warm day after a long winter, uncertain whether to trust it, grateful for it anyway. She might have told him about her father's debt that same evening. She almost did. Except, riders came up the road just past dusk 2 days later, and whatever slow, careful thing had begun, growing between them, got interrupted before it had the chance to finish taking root. It was Elias. He rode up alone, no deputy trailing him for once, and something in the set of his shoulders told Jonas before he'd even dismounted that this wasn't a social call. "Sheriff," Jonas said, cool, standing at the porch rail with his arms crossed. "Didn't expect you out this way. Need to speak with my daughter." Bea came to the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron, and something in her face went carefully blank the moment she saw him, the particular blankness of a woman bracing for weather. "Say what you came to say, Pa." Elias glanced at Jonas, clearly hoping for privacy he wasn't going to get. Jonas didn't move an inch. "Danvers is pushing on the note again," Elias said finally, low, like the words cost him something to hand over. "Says the wedding's bought me time but not forgiveness. Wants the north pasture signed over by spring, or he'll call the whole debt due at once." "And you rode out here," Bea said slowly, "to tell me that." "Why?" Elias's jaw worked. "Thought you might talk to your husband about lending a hand. Man's got a fine reputation now, taming that horse. Danvers might listen to reason from him where he won't from me." Something cold moved through Bea's chest. "You want Jonas to go beg Danvers on your behalf?" Her voice had gone very quiet, very even. The particular evenness that came right before something in her cracked wide open. "The same man who ruined a family for their water rights. The same man whose horse you handed my husband to break, half hoping he'd get killed in the process so you wouldn't owe anybody anything. That's not, isn't it?" Bea stepped forward, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she didn't shrink back from her own height, didn't fold herself smaller to make the moment easier for somebody else to stand in front of. "Tell me the truth, Pa, just once. Why did you really hand me over on that platform instead of Louisa?" Elias's eyes slid away from hers, toward the horizon, toward anywhere that wasn't his daughter's face. "Because Danvers told me to," he said finally, and the words came out flat, defeated, a man too tired to keep building the lie any higher. Said Louisa needed to stay clean for their engagement. Said a scandal involving her would sour the match, and the match was worth more to me than the wager. Said you were— He stopped. "Say it." "Said you were already more trouble than you were worth around here, asking questions about him, knowing things you had no business knowing. Said marrying you off quiet, out of town, out of earshot, would solve 2 problems at once." The yard went very still. Bea felt something in her chest that she'd expected to be pain, and instead, strangely, felt more like relief. Because for 20 years she'd wondered, in some deep unexamined corner of herself, whether her father's cruelty was simply the ordinary cruelty a plain, oversized daughter earned by existing. It had never been that. It had been calculation. Colder, somehow, and easier to carry than shame had ever been. "Get off this land," she said quietly. "Bea," you heard her. Jonas's voice, low and dangerous in a way Elias hadn't heard from him before. "Get off this land, Sheriff, and don't come back asking favors on Danvers's behalf. Not to her, not to me." Elias looked between the two of them a long moment. Then, without another word, he mounted up and rode back toward town, and Bea stood watching him go, with an expression Jonas couldn't quite read. "You knew," he said quietly, once the dust had settled. "Didn't you? About the debt." "Some of it." She wrapped her arms around herself, though the evening wasn't cold. "I overheard him and Danvers talking, back in the spring, before the wager. I didn't know the whole shape of it. Didn't know they'd planned it out so far in advance. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because it wasn't my story to hand you," she said, echoing words she'd used once before, back at the corral, a lifetime ago. "And because some part of me was afraid if you knew how tangled up in Danvers's business my own family was, you'd think twice about staying." Jonas crossed the porch and took her hand, careful the way he'd taken it that evening 2 days back. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "Whatever your father's tangled up in, whatever Danvers wants from him." He meant it. He didn't yet know how soon that promise was going to be tested. Louisa Prescott sat at her dressing table that same week, turning Danvers's ring in the lamplight, and found herself, not for the first time lately, unable to summon the excitement she'd felt back in April when he'd first slipped it onto her finger. "You're distracted," Danvers said from the doorway, watching her with an expression she'd once mistaken for fondness and had lately started reading as something closer to inventory. "Just tired. Your father tells me he visited your sister's ranch." Louisa's hand went still around the ring. "Did he?" Came back with nothing to show for it. Danvers crossed the room, unhurried, and took her chin between two fingers, gentle in a way that somehow still managed to feel like a correction rather than an affection. I'd rather you didn't concern yourself with Bea's household, Louisa. Messy business, all of it. Not fit for a bride with a wedding of her own to plan. She's my sister. She made her choice on that platform. His voice stayed smooth, pleasant, and somehow that made it worse. Best you let her live with it. Louisa didn't answer. Something in her chest had started, slow and unfamiliar, to itch with the discomfort she didn't yet have words for. Watching this man who was meant to be devoted to her instruct her, gently but absolutely, on which of her own family members she was permitted to worry about. She told herself it was nothing. She was good at telling herself that lately about a great many small things that didn't quite sit right. She wasn't sure anymore how much longer she'd manage to keep believing it. The weeks after Elias's visit passed differently than the ones before it had. Something had shifted between them, subtle but real, the particular shift that happens when two people stop keeping the biggest, heaviest things locked away from each other. Jonas started reaching for her hand crossing the yard, small and unremarkable, the kind of gesture that meant nothing to anybody watching and everything to the two people doing it. Bea started laughing again. Actually laughing, a sound Jonas realized one evening he hadn't heard from her since that very first week at the corral, and hearing it again felt like watching color come back into a sky that had gone gray for longer than either of them had noticed. Neither of them said the word love, not yet. Some words needed more ground cleared before a person trusted themselves to plant them, but something was growing there anyway, quiet and patient, the way most real things grow. There were small proofs of it, if a person knew where to look. Jonas fixing the hinge on the garden gate before she'd even mentioned it creaked. Bea leaving his coffee exactly the way he liked it, black, too strong, without being asked twice. A shared laugh one evening over a hen that had taken to roosting in the wagon bed, ridiculous and small and entirely theirs. One night he caught her humming, while she worked the evening chores, that same low wordless tune she'd taught the horse to trust, and something in his chest turned over slow and warm, watching her from the porch, unnoticed, for longer than he probably should have, which was, of course, exactly the moment it all nearly burned down. Silas Danvers had never much cared for loose ends. He sat in his study that same week, a glass of good whiskey untouched at his elbow, listening to a hired man's report with the particular stillness of someone doing arithmetic behind an otherwise pleasant face. The girl's still asking questions in town, the man said, about the horse, where he came from. Danvers set his glass down, slow, deliberate. He'd known from the very first morning at the fair that the Prescott girl was a complication rather than an asset, too observant, too stubborn, too likely to remember small details other people conveniently forgot. And now she'd gone and married a man with a decorated war record and a growing reputation for stubbornness of his own. A man like that, married to a woman who'd overheard too much in too many hallways over too many years, was not a man Danvers particularly wanted developing a taste for asking questions. A story like that has a way of making people curious. Danvers said, almost idle, about where a fine animal like that came from in the first place. Who owned him before? What might have happened out on that homestead all those years back? The hired man said nothing, waiting. I think, Danvers said finally, it's time somebody reminded this county that wild things have a habit of staying wild, no matter how gentle they look for a season. He didn't say the word fire. He never said the word out loud for anything, not once in 15 years of quietly ruining men who stood between him and what he wanted. He simply named an amount and a night, and trusted the particular kind of man who worked for him to understand exactly what shape the rest of the arrangement needed to take. The hired man nodded once and let himself out. Danvers picked his glass back up, drank slow, unbothered, the way a man drinks when he's long since stopped feeling the weight of decisions like this one. Outside his window, past the ridge, past 2 miles of good grazing land he'd acquired through means nobody in the county had ever successfully questioned out loud. A small ranch sat dark and unsuspecting under a moonless sky. The fire started a little past midnight on a night with no moon and a wind out of the northwest that Jonas would spend a long time afterward wishing he'd paid more attention to. He woke first to the smell, smoke thick and wrong, curling in under the bedroom door in a way that had his whole body moving before his mind had finished catching up to what was happening. Bea, he was already out of bed, already pulling on boots. Bea, wake up. Fire. She was up before he'd finished the sentence, some old instinct of her own snapping into place, and together they burst out onto the porch to a sight that stopped Jonas's heart cold in his chest. The barn was burning, not smoldering, not catching slow the way an accident might catch, A lantern knocked over, a spark from the stove drifting somewhere it shouldn't have. This was already a wall of orange, climbing fast up the near side of the structure, and inside that wall, Jonas could hear it, sharp and terrible over the crackle and roar, horses screaming. His voice broke on the word, go. Bea was already moving, faster than he'd ever seen her move, sprinting barefoot across the yard toward the barn's side door. I'll get the near stalls. You take the far side. Don't you dare stop for me, Jonas. Just go. He went. The heat hit him first, a solid wall of it, thick enough to feel like something you could lean against. Smoke rolled black and choking along the rafters, and somewhere in the chaos he heard shadows scream, high and frantic, the exact sound the Stallion used to make 3 months back, when the whole world still looked like an enemy to him. Jonas fought his way toward the sound, coughing, eyes streaming, hands finding the latch of Shadow's stall more by memory than by sight. Easy, he gasped, throat raw. Easy, I've got you. Come on. The horse fought him at first, panic overriding every ounce of trust 3 months had built, hooves striking dangerously close to Jonas's ribs in the smoke-thick dark. And then, from somewhere behind him, he heard it, low, wordless. The tune Bea had taught him, carried through smoke and chaos in a voice gone rough with coughing but steady all the same. Shadow's ears found the sound before his eyes could have. His panic broke, just enough. Just long enough for Jonas to get a lead rope over his head and haul him stumbling toward the door and out into the cold night air. He turned back immediately. 2 more horses still trapped, the gelding pair he and Bea had been training for the buyer, and beyond them, deeper in, a section of roof already groaning under its own collapsing weight. Bea! He couldn't see her through the smoke. Bea, where are you? Here. Her voice, from the far side, and then she was there, materializing out of the smoke like something out of a story he'd tell for the rest of his life. 1 gelding's lead rope in each fist, hauling both animals forward with a strength that should have belonged to a man twice her size, and somehow, in that moment, belonged entirely and only to her. A support beam cracked somewhere above them, loud as a gunshot. Move! Jonas lunged forward, caught her arm, and together they half-dragged, half-ran the horses the last stretch toward the door, as the whole rear section of the barn came down behind them in a roar of sparks and splintering wood. They collapsed together in the dirt of the yard, coughing, soot-streaked, horses stamping and blowing hard around them, and for a long moment neither one of them could do anything but breathe. You're bleeding, Jonas managed finally hoarse. Bea looked down at her own arm, a gash deep enough to worry about, torn open somewhere in the chaos, blood running dark down toward her wrist. And there, above the gash, high up near her elbow, where a rolled and torn nightdress sleeve had never once before been pulled back in front of him, Jonas saw something else. An old scar, thin and pale, running along her upper forearm in a way that had nothing to do with tonight's fire at all. Bea. His voice went very quiet. What is that? She pulled her sleeve down fast, an old reflex, and looked away. It's nothing. That's not nothing. He caught her hand before she could finish covering it. Gentle, careful. The way you'd handle something you'd just realized was more fragile than it had ever let on. That's old. That's years old. Bea, who did that to you? For a long moment she didn't answer. The barn behind them popped and hissed, collapsing further into embers, and the horses shifted nervous in the dark. And Bea sat there in the dirt with her torn sleeve and her bleeding arm, and 20 years of a truth she'd never once said out loud to anybody. I was 14, she said finally, very quiet. Growth spurt that summer. Grew 4 inches taller than every boy in my class. Pa said I'd embarrassed him at church, standing a head above the other girls at confirmation. Her voice stayed flat, careful, the particular flatness of someone reciting something they'd long ago stopped letting themselves feel while saying it out loud. Took his belt to me that night. Told me a daughter who couldn't make herself smaller had no business complaining about how the world looked at her. I've kept my sleeves down ever since. Habit, same as everything else. Jonas felt something in his chest go white hot and very still. Both. He hit her once. Never again after that, not that way. She looked down at the old scar like it belonged to somebody else's arm entirely. I learned to be careful instead. Learned to take up less room. Easier that way, safer. Jonas pulled her into his arms. Right there in the smoke-hazed dirt of the yard, horses milling nervous around them, the barn still hissing its way toward ash behind them, and held on like he was trying to make up, in one single moment, for every single year nobody had held her like this before. You don't have to be careful with me, he said into her hair, rough with smoke and something else entirely. Not ever. Do you hear me? Bea, not ever again, she didn't answer. Couldn't, not with her throat gone tight and her whole chest caving in around something she'd spent 20 years keeping locked down. But she held on, tight, like she believed him, at least a little for the first time in longer than she could remember. Morning came gray and smelling of ash. What was left of the barn stood as a blackened skeleton against the sunrise. Timber still smoking in places. The whole structure collapsed in on itself, like something that had simply given up holding its own shape. Jonas walked the wreckage slow, careful, Bea a step behind him with a bandaged arm and eyes that hadn't quite lost the wide, shocked look they'd woken up with. Could have been the lantern, Jonas said, mostly to himself, mostly hoping. Left it too close to the loft, hey maybe. You didn't leave a lantern in the loft. Bea's voice was steady now, the shock burning off into something harder, more focused. You never do. You check it every night before bed. I've watched you do it for months. I know, because he did know, and some part of him had known it the moment he'd smelled the smoke, that a man careful enough never whoops. A lantern lit didn't suddenly start the night everything he loved nearly burned to the ground. He crouched near the barn's far corner where the fire had clearly started, judging by how the timber there had gone to ash faster and more completely than anywhere else. He pushed aside a charred beam. Underneath it, half buried in soot, sat the unmistakable remains of a kerosene can. Not one of his. He kept his own supply in the tack shed well away from the hay, another careful habit born of years scouting in country where a single spark could cost you everything. Bea, his voice had gone low, dangerous. Come look at this. She crouched beside him, went very still. That's not ours. No, neither of them said the name out loud. They didn't need to. It hung in the smoke-thick morning air between them anyway, heavy and certain as the ash still drifting down around their shoulders. They sat together on the porch steps afterward, the sun climbing slow over the ruined barn, and Bea, for the first time, in the whole shape of their strange marriage, told him everything. Not the pieces she'd handed him before, careful and rationed, one small truth at a time when she judged it safe enough to release. All of it in one long unbroken telling, the way a person finally sets down a weight they've been carrying so long their arms have forgotten what it feels like to be empty. She told him about the Homesteader family, what little she'd pieced together over years of half-heard conversations behind closed doors, about her father's debts, older and deeper than even Elias had admitted to on his last visit, stretching back years before the wager was ever struck, about the particular way Danvers had of visiting the house when she was a girl, always polite, always smiling, always leaving her with an unplaceable unease she'd never once had the words or the standing to voice out loud. I used to think I was imagining it, she admitted, staring out at the wreckage, that I was just a strange oversized girl looking for reasons to distrust a man everybody else admired. Pa always made me feel that way, like my own instincts were something wrong with me, same as my height, same as everything else about me he never approved of. Your instincts were right, Jonas said quietly. Every single time, about the horse, about Danvers, about all of it. I know that now. She looked at him, something steady and clear-eyed in her face that hadn't been there back at the corral. All those months ago, when she'd still measured every word before letting it out. I spent 20 years being told I saw things wrong. Turns out I was the only one in that house seeing anything clearly at all. Jonas took her hand, careful with the bandage still wrapped around her forearm. You're not alone in it anymore, he said. Whatever we find out about him, whatever it costs to bring it into the light, we do it together. Bea nodded, and something in her chest, some old locked room she'd kept sealed her whole life, finally quietly opened. By mid-morning, word of the fire had already reached town, the way word of anything reached town in Ironwood Hollow, faster than any rider could actually carry it. Except the version making the rounds by the time Dutch rode out to check on them wasn't the version Jonas and Bea had lived through. Whole town saying that Stallion got loose in the night, Dutch said, grim, standing at the edge of the wreckage with his hat in his hands, saying he kicked over a lantern himself, saying maybe he was never properly tamed at all, just quiet enough to fool folks for a season before his true nature came back out. That's not what happened, Bea said, sharp. Shadow was in his stall the whole night. We pulled him out ourselves, half dead from the smoke. I believe you. Dutch's eyes were steady, sympathetic in a way that had nothing performative in it, but belief don't travel near as fast as a good rumor does, and somebody's already made sure this one's traveling plenty fast. Jonas felt the shape of it settle into place, cold and deliberate, because a story about a wild horse's true nature finally coming out wasn't just convenient, it was useful. It cast doubt on everything Jonas had built his reputation on all spring. It cast doubt on Bea's skill, her judgment, everything she'd poured into that animal for 2 years before Jonas had ever arrived to take the credit for it. and it drew every eye in the county away from the one detail that actually mattered. A kerosene can that didn't belong to anybody who lived on this property. Somebody wants folks looking at the horse, Jonas said slowly, so nobody looks at the can. Danvers, Bea said, quiet and certain. We don't have proof. Not yet. Jonas straightened, jaw set hard. A kerosene can and a rumor won't hold up against a man who owns half the county's businesses and most of its good opinion. Then we get proof. He looked at her, really looked, the way he'd been learning to do for months now, and saw something in her face that hadn't been there back at that first corral. Back when she'd still been a woman who kept her eyes down and her voice flat and her whole self folded small enough not to be noticed. Anger. Clean and purposeful, the kind that builds rather than burns. He's tried to burn down what's mine, Jonas said. Tried to make it look like your years of work meant nothing. Tried to make the whole town believe a lie about an animal you saved with your own 2 hands. He's done worse than that to other people, Bea said. Long before us. Then it's time somebody made him answer for all of it. Not just the horse. Not just the barn. Jonas's voice hardened, resolve settling into it like iron finding its shape in a forge. Every family he's ruined. Every debt he's used to trap somebody smaller than him. All of it. Bea took his hand, and for once, neither one of them let go too soon. Where do we start? She asked. They started with Amos Kittredge because Amos had already handed Jonas a piece of the truth months back and struck Jonas as a man who likely had more pieces than he'd been willing to hand over the first time. They found him on his same porch step. Same pipe, same tired watchfulness in his weathered face, and when Jonas told him about the kerosene can, about the rumor already spreading through town, Amos's expression didn't so much as flicker with surprise. Figured it was only a matter of time, the old man said, tapping his pipe out slow against the rail. Danvers don't like folks getting too curious about him. Learned that the hard way myself, some years back. What happened to you? Amos was quiet a long moment, deciding, the way he always decided, how much truth a person could carry. Lost my east pasture to him, 12 years back now. His voice had gone rough old grief, worn smooth at the edges but never fully healed over. Wouldn't sell at his price. Woke up one morning to find half my herd run off in the night. Gates left open like they'd wandered off themselves. Cost me near everything. Sold the pasture cheap after that, same as everybody else does eventually. You never told anybody, Sheriff. Amos's laugh had no humor in it at all. Elias Prescott took my statement, nodded along real sympathetic, and never once followed up on a single thing. Funny that, considering how close he and Danvers have always run in each other's business. Bea's jaw tightened at that. Another small betrayal added to a long list she'd been keeping her whole life without meaning to. You said 3 men, Jonas said slowly. Back when you first told me about the horse's family. 4, if you count me. 5, counting whatever happened last night at your place. Amos met Jonas's eyes, steady. Man's been doing this a long while, son. Getting away with it a long while, too. Takes more than one barn fire and an old drifter's word to bring down somebody with that much money behind him. Then we get more than one barn fire, Bea said. We find every single family he's ruined, every debt he's used to trap somebody. We put it all in one place where nobody can look us away from it anymore. Amos studied her a long moment, something like respect moving slow across his weathered features. Your mother would have been proud of you, girl, he said quietly. She had that same stubborn fire in her before she passed. Didn't figure you'd inherited it, way your pa's kept you folded up small all these years. Glad to see I was wrong about that. Bea didn't trust her voice to answer that. She simply nodded once and let the words settle somewhere warm in her chest, that she'd examine properly later, when there was time for it. Word of the fire moved through Ironwood Hollow, same as every other piece of news did, fast and warped in the telling, except this time something unexpected happened along the way. Not everybody believed the wild horse story. Dutch mentioned it first. A few days later, leaning on the same fence rail he'd leaned on all spring, watching Jonas get thrown. Half the town still saying it was the Stallion. But there's another half asking why a horse, gentle enough to ride bareback through the square last month, would suddenly turn killer in the dead of night for no reason at all. Which half are you? Jonas asked. The half that's watched you two work that animal for 6 months straight. Dutch spat. Unceremonious man's doesn't build that kind of trust with an animal just to have it burn his own barn down around him. Don't take a genius to see the story don't hold together. It wasn't much. A handful of doubters in a town that had spent all spring and summer betting against Jonas succeeding at anything. But it was something, a crack of daylight in what had, until now, felt like a solid wall of rumor built specifically to bury the truth. Small towns, Bea said quietly, watching Dutch ride off. Slow to believe you. Slower still to admit they were wrong about somebody. But not impossible, no. She looked out toward the ridge, toward the fine house, sitting comfortable and untouched beyond it. Not impossible. Just going to take more than a fence rail conversation to finish the job. Jonas looked out past the smoking ruin of the barn, toward the ridge where Danvers's land began somewhere past the horizon line. The same ridge he'd once stood staring at after a late-night conversation with an old man on a porch who'd warned him not to go digging. "We start," he said, "by finding out exactly how many other fires that man's lit in this county, and exactly how many people were too afraid to say so out loud." Behind them, Shadow paced the makeshift paddock they'd rigged from the surviving fence rails, ears pricked, watching the two of them with the same steady, patient intelligence that had once, not so very long ago, belonged to an animal everyone in Ironwood Hollow had written off as unsavable. Some things, Bea thought, watching him, could be saved after all. It just took somebody willing to stand close enough, long enough, to prove it. 15 years of getting away with it had made Silas Danvers patient, but not forgiving, and one failed fire was not. In his private accounting, reason enough to call the matter closed. The second attempt came 8 days after the first, and this time Jonas was ready for it. He'd taken to sleeping light since the fire, one ear tuned to the yard even in his deepest hours of rest, a habit 10 years of scouting had never fully let go of him, and that he was, for the first time, grateful to still be carrying. Because a man learns things in 10 years of watching a border nobody else wanted to watch. Learns the particular quality of silence right before something goes wrong. Learns it in his bones, in the base of his skull, in the way his whole body goes still, and listening even while the rest of him stays convincingly, deceptively asleep. So when a shadow moved along the tree line just past midnight, he was already awake before the dog started barking. Bea low, urgent, someone's out there. She was up in an instant, reaching for the shotgun kept loaded beside the bed, a habit of her own that had nothing to do with scouting and everything to do with growing up in a house where a sheriff's daughter learned early how to protect herself. They moved together to the window, watched. A single rider, keeping to the shadow of the fence line, moving slow and deliberate toward the paddock where Shadow and the surviving stock had been kept since the barn burned. Not the house, Jonas thought, cataloging it fast, the way he'd once cataloged enemy movements in half a heartbeat. Because half a heartbeat was sometimes all a man got. Not the house, Bea whispered, echoing the same thought a half-second behind him. The horses again. Jonas's jaw tightened, because if the first fire had been a message, this one was clearly meant to finish delivering it. "Stay back," he said. "No." I said no. Her voice quiet but absolute. "I've spent this whole marriage watching men decide what's dangerous enough for me to handle. Not tonight. Not with our horses out there." He didn't argue further. There wasn't time. And some part of him, watching her check the shotgun's load with steady practiced hands, understood that arguing would have been both useless and wrong. They went out the back together, low quiet, circling wide around the paddock the way Jonas had once circled enemy positions, a decade back in country far more dangerous than this one. The rider had nearly reached the fence when Jonas's voice cut through the dark. "That's far enough." The man froze, turned. A younger fellow, unfamiliar, a coil of rope and a can Jonas recognized with sick certainty slung over one shoulder. "Hands where I can see them," Bea said, shotgun leveled, steady as stone. The man's eyes went wide, taking in the rifle, and the woman holding it with equal alarm. "I ain't looking for trouble," he stammered. "Then you've picked a strange hour to go creeping around another man's paddock with a kerosene can," Jonas said, closing the distance slow and careful. "Who sent you?" Silence. "Who?" Bea said again, and something in her voice, flat and certain and utterly without patience left in it, made the man's shoulders sag. "Danvers," he admitted quiet. "Paid me $50. Said if I got caught that was my own trouble, not his. Said nobody'd believe a hired hand's word against a man like him anyhow." Jonas looked at Bea. Something passed between them, unspoken. The particular understanding of two people who'd just been handed exactly what they needed, and knew precisely how fragile a gift like that could turn out to be if they didn't move fast enough. "You're going to tell that to the circuit judge," Jonas said, word for word. "Danvers'll kill me for it." "Danvers already tried to kill us twice," Bea said. "You've got a choice to make, mister. Whose side of that particular ledger you'd rather end up standing on?" The man looked between them a long moment. Then, slow, he nodded. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. And starts, Bea had learned this whole long strange year, were worth considerably more than they looked like from the outside. They rode into town before dawn, their captured witness bound and silent, on a spare horse between them, and went straight to the one place Jonas still hoped, despite everything, might do the right thing when it mattered. The judge's circuit brought him through Ironwood Hollow only once a season, and by cruel or lucky timing, depending how a person looked at it, he was due into town that very week to settle a string of minor disputes nobody had expected to matter half as much as this one suddenly did. Judge Aldous Whitfield was a narrow man with narrow spectacles and a reputation, rare enough in that part of the territory, for much caring whose money sat heaviest in whose pocket. He listened to the hired man's confession without interrupting. Listened to Jonas describe the kerosene confound in the barn's wreckage. Listened, longest of all, to Bea, who told her account plain and steady, without flourish, the particular steadiness of a woman who had spent her whole life being disbelieved, and had finally found somebody willing to actually listen through to the end. "This is a serious accusation," Whitfield said when she'd finished, adjusting his spectacles, "against men of considerable standing in this county. Standing built on other people's ruin," Bea said. "Ask Amos Kittredge about his east pasture. Ask whoever's left of the family that used to own our Stallion, if you can even find them, which I doubt, given how thoroughly Mr. Danvers tends to make people disappear once they've stopped being useful to him. That's a strong claim. It's a true one." Her chin came up, level, unflinching. "I've spent 20 years watching this county look the other way from that man because looking straight at him was inconvenient. I'm asking you not to look away, Judge. Just this once." Whitfield studied her a long moment. Something in his narrow, careful face shifted, the particular shift of a man deciding, consciously, to do his actual job rather than the easier version of it. "I'll need more than one hired man's word," he said finally, "and more than a kerosene can. But I'll open an inquiry, formally, which means Mr. Danvers will be required to answer for himself under oath in front of this whole town." It wasn't a conviction. It wasn't even close to one, not yet. But it was daylight, finally. Real daylight, falling for the first time on a man who'd spent 15 years operating comfortably in the dark. In the days before the hearing, Jonas and Bea rode out to find whoever else might still be willing to speak. Most had scattered long ago, run off to other counties, other territories, wherever the money from a forced sale had carried them before it ran out. But one family remained close enough to reach. The Voskuils, Dutch settlers who'd taken a small claim 2 valleys over after selling their original homestead to Danvers for a fraction of its worth, the very homestead Bea now understood with a slow, cold certainty that Shadow had once called home. The mother, a weathered woman named Greet, answered the door with a wariness that took a long moment to soften. "We don't speak of that time," she said, arms crossed. "Made peace with losing it, easier that way." "We're not asking you to relive it for no reason," Jonas said gently. "We're asking because the man who did it to you is finally being called to answer, but only if enough people are brave enough to say what happened." Greet's eyes moved past him to Bea, and something in her weathered face shifted, recognizing perhaps some old kinship in the particular careful way Bea held herself, the posture of someone who'd learned young to take up as little room as possible. "My husband never fully recovered," Greet said quietly. "The accident with the plow horse broke something in his hip that never set right. He still limps 4 years on." She was quiet a moment, and the horse, our Stallion, "I think of him sometimes. Wondered what became of him." "He's alive," Bea said softly. "Gentle now. Safe. I've spent months earning that gentleness back for him." Something in Greet's face crumpled, just slightly, old grief finding an unexpected small mercy after 4 years of carrying it alone. "Then perhaps," she said finally, "it's time I stopped protecting the man who took him from us." She agreed to send a written statement to the judge, unable to travel the distance herself but willing, finally, after years of silence, to put her family's truth on paper where it could no longer be ignored. Jonas and Bea rode home in the fading light with one more piece of the puzzle secured, and somewhere behind them, in a small cabin 2 valleys over, a woman who had spent 4 years believing nobody would ever care enough to ask, sat down at her kitchen table and began slowly to write. Word of the inquiry moved through Ironwood Hollow faster than the fire itself had. By the time the hearing convened 3 days later in the town hall, every seat had filled a full hour before the proceedings began, and men who'd never once shown interest in county business stood packed along the back wall, 3 deep, drawn by the particular electric hum a town gets when it senses, correctly, that something long buried is finally about to come up for air. Elias Prescott sat near the front, unable to avoid it in his official capacity as sheriff, his face gone the particular gray color of a man watching his own past come due at last. Silas Danvers arrived last, as he always did, unhurried, immaculate, taking his seat with the easy confidence of a man who had never once in his life imagined a room like this one could hold consequences for him. Judge Whitfield called the proceedings to order. "We're here," he said, voice carrying flat and clear across the packed hall, "to examine allegations of arson, intimidation, and land fraud against Mr. Silas Danvers. I'll remind everyone present, this is an inquiry, not yet a trial, but I intend to hear every relevant word of testimony before I decide whether it becomes one." Danvers's expression didn't shift. "I welcome the inquiry, Judge. I've nothing to hide. We'll see." The hired man testified first, the same account he'd given at midnight in a moonlit paddock, and Jonas watched Danvers's jaw work almost imperceptibly as $50. And a can of kerosene became, word by careful word, a matter of public record. A disgruntled former employee, Danvers said smoothly when given his chance to respond. "Dismissed for drunkenness last spring. Hardly a reliable witness, Judge, and hardly surprising he'd invent a story to spite me." "I was never in his employ," the young man said, quiet but firm. "Never worked a day for Danvers before he found me at the saloon and offered me $50 for one night's work." Murmurs rippled through the hall. Danvers's easy composure held, but only just, a thin crack showing now at its careful edges. Then Amos Kittredge stood unbidden and asked to be heard. "Man took my east pasture 12 years back," Amos said, voice rough but carrying. "Ran off half my herd in the night to force the sale. I told the sheriff at the time." A long, pointed pause. Sheriff never once followed up. Every eye in the room turned toward Elias Prescott. He sat very still, sweat beading at his hairline despite the cool autumn air, and Bea, watching from beside Jonas, felt something in her chest go tight and expectant, the particular feeling of watching a long-buried thing finally begin working its way up through the ground. "Sheriff Prescott." Judge Whitfield's voice, sharp now, cutting through the murmur. "Is that true? Did you receive a complaint from Mr. Kittredge regarding livestock theft 12 years ago?" Elias's mouth opened, closed, open again. Because here it was, the moment he'd spent 12 years arranging his whole life to avoid, and there was nowhere left in that packed hall to slide his eyes away from it. "Yes," he said finally, barely audible. "And you took no action." He stopped, started again, quieter still. "Mr. Danvers had extended me a loan the previous year. Against my ranch, I was in no position to press an investigation against a man holding paper on my own land." The hall went dead silent. Bea felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her, though she hadn't moved at all. Because there it was, plain and ugly and finally spoken aloud in front of the whole county. Her father hadn't simply failed to protect people from Danvers over the years. He'd been paid in the particular quiet currency of debt forgiveness and looked away eyes, to make certain nobody ever did. "You took a bribe," Judge Whitfield said slowly, "to bury a criminal complaint. I never called it a bribe." Elias's voice had gone thin, defeated. "It was just understood between us, the way business gets done in this county." "That," Whitfield said, "is precisely what a bribe is, Sheriff." Elias didn't answer, couldn't, apparently, find any words left worth spending on his own defense. Danvers rose to his feet then, smooth still, though something had gone tight and careful behind his eyes that hadn't been there an hour earlier. "Judge, this has become a spectacle rather than a proper inquiry, a drifter's grudge, a dismissed hand's fabrication, an old sheriff's private business arrangements from a decade back. None of it touches me directly, doesn't it?" Jonas stood, unable to hold his silence a moment longer. "You bought a stallion from a family you'd already ruined, whipped him raw when he wouldn't break your way, same as you tried to break every single person who's testified in this today. Sold him off when he stopped being useful to you, same as you tried to have him blamed for a fire you paid a man $50 to set." "Careful, Mr. Hartwell." Danvers's voice had lost its warmth entirely now. "Accusations without proof are a dangerous habit. I've got proof standing right beside me." Jonas's hand found Bea's. "A woman who watched you circle her family for 20 years, who overheard you naming your price for her sister's hand, same as you'd name a price for grazing land, who buried a scar on her own arm, rather than admit how deep your reach into this county actually goes." The hall had gone utterly silent now, 300 people leaning forward as one, and Bea felt every eye in the room land on her at once, the same particular weight she'd spent her whole life flinching from. Except this time she didn't flinch. She stood, faced the room, faced Danvers directly, for the first time in 20 years of quiet, careful avoidance. "I was 12 years old," she said, voice steady, "the first time I heard my father and Mr. Danvers discussing which family's water rights they'd be taking next. I didn't understand what I was hearing then. I understand it perfectly now." She let the silence hold a beat before continuing. "You've spent 15 years counting on people like me staying quiet. Counting on the world deciding, long before I ever opened my mouth, that nobody would believe a word I said anyway. She looked directly at Danvers. You counted wrong. The hall erupted, not in laughter this time, not in the old cruel amusement Bea had spent her whole life bracing against, but in something closer to a low, spreading murmur of vindication, the particular sound a town makes when it finally, collectively, stops looking away from something it always half suspected. Judge Whitfield banged his gavel for order, though his own expression, Bea noted, carried something close to grim satisfaction underneath the formality. Mr. Danvers, he said, once the hall had settled, given the testimony heard today, I'm ordering a full formal investigation into your business dealings over the past 15 years, effective immediately. Until that investigation concludes, your assets in this county, including all disputed land acquisitions, will remain under judicial hold. Danvers's face, for the first time in the whole proceeding, lost every trace of its careful composure. You can't be serious. I assure you I am entirely serious. Whitfield's voice hardened. And given the severity of the arson allegations specifically, I'm remanding you into the sheriff's custody pending trial. Every eye in the room swung, almost comically, toward Elias, who stood frozen at the front of the hall, still reeling from his own exposure not 10 minutes earlier. Sheriff Prescott, Whitfield said, "Dry, I trust you're capable of performing this one duty correctly, given the circumstances." Elias's hands shook as he crossed the hall toward Danvers. For one long, terrible moment, the two men who had quietly ruined so much of this county together stood face to face, and something passed between them that Bea, watching, understood without needing it explained. 12 years of careful, comfortable complicity, ending in a town hall in front of 300 witnesses, because a stubborn cowboy and the daughter everybody had spent 2 decades underestimating had refused, finally, to stay quiet. Louisa hadn't come to the hearing. She'd stayed home, unable to face whatever version of the truth was about to unfold in that packed hall. And it was Ruth, breathless and pale, who rode out to tell her what had happened. They arrested him, Ruth said, still catching her breath in the parlor doorway. Danvers, right there in the town hall. Pa's the one who had to do it. Louisa sat very still at her dressing table, Danvers's ring catching the afternoon light exactly the way it had every day for the past 5 months. Arrested for what? Arson, land fraud. Bribing Pa years back to look the other way while he ruined half the county. Ruth's voice cracked. They're saying he tried to have Bea and her husband killed. Twice. Louisa's hand went slow and unsteady to the ring on her finger. She thought of every small correction he'd offered her over the months. Gentle, and always somehow leaving her smaller than she'd been before he'd spoken. She thought of the particular way he'd instructed her, just last week, on which of her own family's troubles she was permitted to concern herself with. She thought, with a clarity that arrived far too late to spare her any of the humiliation still ahead, that she had spent 5 months mistaking control for devotion, and nobody, not once, had thought to warn her that the two could look so similar from the inside. The wedding had been scheduled for the following Sunday. Louisa didn't attend the ceremony that never happened. She was 3 counties away by then on a stagecoach she'd boarded before dawn with a single trunk and a note left behind for her father that said considerably more than 4 words this time. I won't build my life on what he built his. I'm sorry it took me this long to see it. She didn't say where she was going. Nobody in Ironwood Hollow ever found out. Not for certain, though Bea liked to imagine, in the months that followed, that her sister had finally gone looking for a version of her own worth that didn't depend on any man's ring to prove it. 2 weeks after the hearing, once the dust of the whole ordeal had begun slowly to settle, Jonas found Bea sitting alone on the fence rail of the new paddock, watching shadow graze in the last gold light of an early autumn evening. He climbed up beside her. Didn't say anything at first, just sat, the way they'd sat together so many evenings that first summer, before either of them had understood what was quietly growing between them. You were magnificent, he said finally, in that hall. I was terrified. Didn't look it. Learned a long time ago how not to look things I actually am. She glanced at him, something soft and unguarded in her face now that had taken the whole autumn to arrive there. Habits hard to unlearn. You don't have to unlearn it around me. He took, careful, the way he always was now with the still healing scar on her forearm. But you also don't have to keep it up. Not anymore. Not with me. Bea looked down at their joined hands a long moment. Jonas. Her voice had gone quiet, careful. Back at the wedding. You hesitated, before you kissed me. He didn't look away from that, though she watched him want to, just for a second. I know. Why? He was quiet a moment, searching for the honest answer the way he always did now, rather than the easy one. Because I was still grieving something that was never real to begin with, he said finally. A dream I'd built out of a woman's face and nothing underneath it. And some part of me was afraid that if I let myself want you, fully, without holding anything back, I'd be admitting the whole dream had been foolish from the start. Was it? Foolish? Maybe. A small, rueful smile. But it walked me 20 miles to a corral where you were waiting, so I've made my peace with it. Bea's breath caught. I love you, Jonas said, plain and unhesitating this time. No pause. No held breath. No careful distance left between the words and the truth underneath them. Not out of duty. Not out of honor, though I've got plenty of that too. I love you, Bea Hartwell. I didn't see you that first spring. But I see you now, and I don't want to spend one more day pretending otherwise. Bea's tears came fast and unguarded, and this time she didn't hide them, didn't turn her face away, didn't fold herself smaller to make the moment easier for anybody watching, because there was nobody watching except the man who just handed her. Finally, completely, the one thing she'd spent her whole life afraid to hope for. I love you too, she said, and the words came out steady, sure. The truest thing she'd ever said out loud in that particular voice. I think I have for longer than I let myself admit. He kissed her then, unhesitating, and Shadow lifted his head from the grass to watch them with mild, uninterested equine patience, and somewhere past the ridge, in a jail cell that would hold him for a good long while, a man who had spent 15 years believing himself untouchable, sat alone with nothing left to count except the walls closing in around him. The trial itself took the better part of a month, delayed twice while the judge's investigators rode out across 3 counties tracking down every family Danvers had quietly ruined over 15 years of careful, patient cruelty. They found more than anyone had expected. A total of 6 separate families, going back further than even Amos had known about, each one bearing some version of the same story. A debt called due at the worst possible moment. An accident that wasn't. A price offered that wasn't really an offer at all. Bea sat through every day of the proceedings she was permitted to attend, and on the final afternoon, when the jury filed back in after less than an hour's deliberation, she found Jonas's hand and held on tight enough that neither one of them could have said, afterward, whose grip had been steadying whose. On the charge of arson, the jury foreman read guilty. On the charge of extortion, guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit bodily harm, guilty. The hall erupted, not into laughter this time, not into the old cruel murmur Bea had spent her whole life bracing against, but into something that sounded, for the first time in 15 years, like genuine relief. Judge Whitfield's sentence came swift and without mercy. Danvers's land, all of it, the acres he'd built his fortune stealing one ruined family at a time, was ordered returned or compensated to its rightful former owners wherever they could still be located. What remained went toward a lengthy prison term, far from Ironwood Hollow. Far from anybody left in this county, with reason to fear the sound of his name. He didn't look at Bea as they led him from the courtroom. Didn't look at anybody, in fact, his careful composure finally, completely, gone, replaced with the particular hollow stare of a man who had spent his whole life believing himself above consequence, and had just discovered, far too late to matter, exactly how wrong that belief had been. Bea watched him go and felt, strangely, less triumph than she'd expected to feel. Mostly, she just felt tired. The particular clean tiredness of a person who has finally, after 20 years, set down something impossibly heavy. It's over, Jonas said quietly beside her. No, Bea said, watching the courtroom empty around them. It's just starting. This part's just where the fear stops. Everything after this is ours to build. The town council met the following week to decide what became of Elias Prescott's badge, and the decision, once it came, surprised nobody who'd sat through the hearing. 12 years, the council chairman said, reading from a prepared statement in a voice that carried no particular relish in the task. 12 years you wore that badge while taking money to look away from crimes committed against your own neighbors. This council finds you unfit to continue serving as sheriff of Ironwood Hollow, effective immediately. Elias didn't argue, didn't have the energy left for it, apparently, standing there in the same town hall where his own daughter had stood 2 weeks earlier, and refused, for the first time in her life, to make herself smaller for anybody's comfort. He unpinned the badge himself, set it on the table without a word, and walked out of that hall a different man than he'd walked in as 12 years, and one very long month earlier. Winter came hard that year, but the rebuilding started before the first real snow. Word had spread through the county, the way word did, that the Hartwell barn had burned in an arson, meant to silence a family that had refused to stay silent, and something in that story Once it had finished making its slow rounds through Ironwood Hollow, seemed to soften a good portion of the town's old cruelty into something closer to shame. Neighbors who'd never once spoken a kind word to Babi in 20 years showed up with lumber and nails and rough, unpracticed apologies offered sideways, the way apologies get offered by people more comfortable with hammers than with honesty. Dutch came, of course, and brought 2 other ranhands with him. Mrs. Odom's husband came, driving a wagon loaded with good milled timber he refused to accept payment for. Even Amos Kittredge showed up, too old now for heavy work, but he sat on an overturned bucket the whole first day, directing traffic and telling stories, and Bea found, watching him, that she didn't mind the company nearly as much as the old version of herself might have expected to. By the time the first snow finally came, the new barn stood taller and sturdier than the old one had, built by more hands than either Jonas or Bea had ever imagined would show up to help. "Town's changing its mind about you," Jonas said one evening, watching the last of the volunteers ride off toward home. "Town's changing its mind about a lot of things," Bea said. "Might take longer than one barn raising to finish the job, but it's a start." Spring came slow that year, the way it always did after a hard winter, and with it came something neither Jonas nor Bea had quite planned for, though looking back on it later, neither of them was surprised it had happened. It started with a man named Reeves, a cavalry veteran, missing most of one hand, turned away from 3 different ranches for work because nobody wanted to bother training a man they assumed couldn't hold a rope properly anymore. "Heard you might not mind a man who's slower than most," Reeves said, standing awkward at the gate, the same particular awkwardness Mrs. Odom had once carried asking for help. She wasn't sure she'd be given. Bea looked at his ruined hand a long moment, then at his eyes, steady, hopeful despite every rejection that had led him here. "Slower's fine," she said. "We've got time." Reeves stayed. Turned out, within a month, that a missing hand mattered considerably less than most ranches had assumed it would, once somebody bothered teaching him to compensate for it, rather than simply writing him off. He told them his story slow, over several weeks, the way a man tells you something once he's decided you've earned the trust of hearing it. A cavalry charge gone wrong, a saber that had taken more than it should have, a homecoming to a town that looked at his ruined hand and decided, without ever once asking him what he could still do, that he was finished being useful. "Folks see the missing part," he said one evening, working a length of rope one-handed with a dexterity that had taken him 2 long years to rebuild. "Never bother looking at what's still there." "I know something about that," Bea said. "Figured you might." It became, without either of them planning it, the particular unspoken language of the whole ranch. Nobody asked what a person was missing. They asked, instead, what a person could still do, and built the work around the answer rather than around the absence. Others followed, slow at first and then steadier. A widow named Constance, whose husband's death had left her with a debt-ridden claim, and a county full of men eager to buy her out cheap, the same way Danvers had once bought out families who couldn't fight back. A young woman named Sarah, tall and broad-shouldered, same as Bea had always been, run out of 2 other towns for the crime of not fitting whatever narrow shape those towns had decided a woman was supposed to hold. "They said I was too much," Sarah told Bea. The first week, quiet and braced for the rejection she'd apparently learned to expect from everyone. "Too much for them, maybe." Bea handed her a lead rope, steady, matter-of-fact. "Not too much for this ranch. Come on, I'll show you how Shadow likes to be approached. Never from the left, mind you. He's particular about that." Sarah worked alongside her most afternoons that first month, and it was on one of them, watching the young woman flinch, instinctively from her own reflection in a water trough, that Bea recognized something of her own younger self staring back. "You keep doing that," Bea said, "looking away from yourself, like you expect it to hurt." Sarah's shoulders tightened. "Habit, I suppose. I had the same habit for 20 years. Bea crouched beside the trough, studying her own reflection alongside Sarah's without flinching from either. "Took me a long while to understand something. The people who taught us to look away from ourselves weren't seeing clearly. They were just small enough inside that anyone standing taller than their own comfort made them feel diminished. That's not how it feels, though, when they're laughing." "No," Bea agreed. "It doesn't. Feels like the truth, some days. Feels like maybe they're right and you're the one who's wrong for taking up the room you take up." She stood, offering Sarah a hand up. "But feelings aren't facts, Sarah. Took a burned barn and a very patient man to teach you a particular lesson. I'm hoping I can teach it to you a good deal faster." Sarah managed a small, unsteady smile, the first Bea had seen from her since she'd arrived. "I'd like that," she said. By the second year, the Hartwell ranch had become something neither Jonas nor Bea had set out to build. Exactly. though both of them agreed, looking back, that it felt like the truest thing either of them had ever been part of. A place for the overlooked, the dismissed. The people the rest of the county had decided, for one reason or another, weren't worth the trouble of looking at closely. It turned out, given half a chance, that most of them were worth considerably more than that. It was Constance who suggested it. One evening near the first anniversary of the fire, the whole strange Foon family of the Hartwell ranch gathered around a long table built from timber the town had donated. "You two never had a real wedding," she said, matter of fact, ladling stew into bowls. "Not one either of you actually chose. Seems a shame given everything since." Bea glanced at Jonas, something uncertain and hopeful moving behind her eyes. "I don't need a fancy ceremony," she said. "Never much wanted one." Constance shrugged, said real. Jonas set down his fork, quiet a moment, turning the idea over. "She's right," he said finally, reaching for Bea's hand across the table. "That first wedding. The vows we said. They were the law's words, not ours. I never once got to choose you out loud in front of people who actually cared to hear it. Jonas, marry me again," he said, simple, unhesitating, the whole table gone quiet and grinning around them. "Properly this time. Not because your father made a promise on a platform. Because I'm choosing you. Because I'll keep choosing you. Every single morning, for the rest of however long you'll have me." Bea's eyes filled fast and unguarded, and this time there was no old habit left in her reaching up to hide it. "Yes," she said 1,000 times, "yes." They held the ceremony 3 weeks later, in the yard behind the rebuilt barn. No platform, no crowd of strangers placing bets on how long it would last. Just Reeves, and Sarah, and Constance, and Dutch, and old Amos Kittredge, sitting proud in the front row, with his pipe unlit out of respect for the occasion. The preacher spoke the same old words. But, this time, when he reached the part about kissing the bride, Jonas didn't hesitate at all. He kissed her like a man who had spent a year learning exactly how much he had to lose, and exactly how grateful he was that he hadn't lost it. Shadow, tied loosely to the fence rail nearby, watched the whole ceremony with the same steady, patient calm that had once, a lifetime ago, belonged to an animal the whole county had written off as unsavable. 2 years to the week after Jonas Hartwell first rode into Ironwood Hollow with a torn coat and a foolish dream, the bride fair returned, same as it did every year. Dust and fiddle music, and a town dressing itself up like it mattered. Except this year, Jonas and Bea walked through that town square together, and something about the way the crowd's eyes moved across them had changed so entirely that Bea, on the particularly good days, almost forgot to brace herself for it out of old habit. "That's the Hartwells," she heard a woman murmur to her companion, no cruelty in it at all this time. "Best horse trainers in 3 counties now. Took in that Reeves boy, nobody else would hire. Heard they've got half a dozen folks living out at that ranch, all of them the town gave up on one way or another. Never thought that marriage would work," the other woman said, dying. "Guess I was wrong." Bea didn't slow her step, didn't need to anymore. Hearing words like that, she simply let them land where they landed. Small proof of a town slowly, imperfectly, learning to see things it had spent decades refusing to look at directly. A rancher Bea had never met stopped her near the mercantile, hat in hand, awkward the way men got awkward apologizing for things they hadn't personally done, but felt implicated by anyway. "My mare's been favoring her off leg all season," he said. "Nobody local's been able to sort it. Wondered if you might have a look, whenever you've a free afternoon." "I'll ride out Thursday," Bea said, and the man nodded, relieved, and moved off into the crowd, and Bea stood there a moment, letting the small, ordinary exchange settle into her chest. 2 years ago, that same man would have crossed the street, rather than address her directly. Now he was standing in the open square, asking for her help, plain as anything, the way you'd ask any respected professional for their expertise. Near the old platform, weathered now, less imposing than it had once looked to a 14-year-old girl. Standing behind a support beam too narrow to properly hide in, they found Elias. Older, thinner, the particular diminished look of a man who'd spent 2 years learning, the hard way, exactly how much of his old standing had depended on a badge and a debt he no longer carried either one of. Bea, his voice when it came, had none of its old command left in it. "Jonas, Pa." They stood a moment in silence, 3 people with a great deal of unspoken history between them and no easy way to begin unpacking it in the middle of a crowded fairground. "I've been meaning to say," Elias started, then stopped, started again. "What I did to you. Both the small cruelties and the large ones. I don't expect you to forgive it. I wouldn't, in your position. I don't forgive it," Bea said, plain, without cruelty but without softening it either. Not yet. Maybe not for a long while still. Elias nodded, accepting that the way a man accepts weather he can't argue with. But I don't hate you either, she continued. Not anymore. Hating you would mean still handing you room in my life to take up, and I've got better uses for that room these days. I understand. I don't need you to understand, Pa. Her voice softened just slightly, the smallest crack of warmth showing through something that had taken 2 years to build back up from nothing. I just needed you to hear it. That's all. She turned to walk away, stopped, turned back. You're welcome to visit the ranch sometime, she said, quieter now, if you ever want to see what I built without your help. Reeves makes good coffee, better than yours ever was. It wasn't forgiveness, not fully, not yet. But it was a door left open a crack, which was more. Elias understood, watching his daughter walk away with her husband's hand in hers, more than he had any right left to expect. Ruth found them near the horse pens a while later, hesitant in a way Bea had never once seen from her younger sister, who had spent her whole life comfortable enough riding along in Louise's easy wake to never need much courage of her own. I never stood up for you, Ruth said, without preamble, twisting her gloved hands together. That day on the platform, I laughed along with everybody else. I've thought about it near every day since. Bea studied her a moment. You were young, scared of being laughed at yourself, probably, if you'd done anything different. That's not an excuse. No, Bea agreed. It isn't. But it's the truth. And I'd rather have the truth than an excuse dressed up prettier than it deserves to be. Ruth's eyes glistened. I don't know how to fix it. You don't fix 20 years in one conversation. He softened just slightly, watching her sister's genuine discomfort with something closer to sympathy than she'd expected to feel. But you could start by actually visiting, not just at the fair, once a year when it's convenient. Sarah's been wanting someone to teach her needlework. You were always good with a needle. Something like hope moved across Ruth's face, tentative and real. I could do that, she said. Then do it, Bea said. Actions carry further than apologies ever have, in my experience. Ruth nodded, and for the first time, in longer than either of them could remember, the two sisters stood together without the old weight of comparison hanging between them. Just two women, imperfect and trying, taking one small, honest step towards something better than what they'd been handed. That evening, back at the ranch, Jonas and Bea sat together on the porch step, watching the sun go down in long streaks of orange and pink over land that had, 2 years back, held nothing but a burned barn and an uncertain marriage. In the distance, laughter carried from the paddock, Reeves and Sarah and Constance working with the horses in the fading light, the particular easy laughter of people who had all, in their own way, been told once that they didn't belong anywhere, and had found, together, a place that proved otherwise. Past the fence, Shadow grazed easy in the last of the light, the old scar along his ribs barely visible now unless a person knew to look for it. He'd taught Bea something long before she'd understood she was learning it, that a wounded thing wasn't the same as a ruined one, that trust could be rebuilt slow and patient by anyone willing to stay close enough, long enough, to prove it was safe to try again. She'd carried that lesson into everyone who'd since found their way to this ranch, into her own marriage, into herself. Do you ever think about that day? Bea asked softly. When Pa pushed me forward on that platform. Do you wish things had gone differently? Jonas turned to look at her, the same steady look he'd been giving her for 2 years now. The look of a man who had stopped, entirely, looking for anything better than what was already sitting right beside him. No, he said, not for a second. Bea smiled, small and certain, because I wouldn't change a single thing, he said. Not the wager, not the fire, not even the years it took me to see what was standing right in front of me the whole time. He squeezed her hand. You know what I've realized, he said, watching this whole town slowly change its mind about you? I spent so long chasing what I thought I wanted, what I thought would finally make me worth something to somebody. He looked at her, everything he felt written plain and unguarded across his face now, no hesitation left in it at all. But I was chasing a dream that never once saw me. Not really. Not the way you did, from that very first morning at the corral. Bea's eyes glistened, though she didn't look away this time, didn't fold herself smaller, didn't do anything but hold his gaze steady and full. You saw me, she said, when the whole rest of the world had already decided I wasn't worth the looking. And you saw me, Jonas answered, even when I didn't see myself. They sat together in the comfortable, unhurried quiet that had taken 2 hard years to build, watching the sun finish its slow descent below the ridge, the laughter of found family, drifting warm across the yard behind them, the first stars coming out thick and close over Ironwood Hollow. Jonas Hartwell sat there with his wife's hand in his, wanting nothing else in the world but exactly what he already had.